All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're scheduled to be here till 4:45 this afternoon. We are discussing the basics, overview, hazardous waste management for generators within the state of California. Show of hands, just so I could see what your guys' baseline knowledge is. Who has ever done any sort of Haz Waste Title 22 RCRA training previously? Okay, small portion. Everyone else, first time you're exposed to it. This is good general information to make you aware of the regulations, expectations. So when Orange County or Anaheim Fire Department shows up at your facility and they say, "We are here to inspect you to make sure that you are properly managing your hazardous waste," this will provide you the baseline knowledge so you know what isn't a hazardous waste, how we have to manage that hazardous waste, whether we put it in a container or a tank, how long we could store it on site, record keeping requirements associated with the hazardous waste, and basic shipping requirements. Since most of you folks have not been exposed to this information before, I imagine there may be a few questions. And this training is intended to increase your knowledge, so please do not hold back. Feel free to ask questions if you have a question. We have a microphone in the middle of the room. Please step up, ask a question. I'll address it as they come up. Otherwise, we could address any questions at the end of the program. So with that, we will go ahead and begin. My name, Steve Reichow. I'm with NES. We are a consulting training firm, so I am not a regulator, not an inspector. I will not show up at your facility, fine you, cite you, tell you that you're doing something incorrectly. I am solely the messenger. So you know that saying? Don't kill the messenger. Don't kill the messenger. So that is my role. So with that, we'll go ahead and start, folks. Now, what we're going to cover today, introduction, and we will look at some definitions from regulations. We will look at how we determine what our generator status is. Because depending on our generator status, that affects how long we could store hazardous waste. What type of training, how often training needs to be provided for facility personnel. And it also affects the fees or the dues that we have to pay annually to our CUPA, the regulatory agency that will inspect our facility. So we'll cover that with the introduction. Then we will look at making a hazardous waste determination. This is one of the most important topics that we're going to cover today. We're not going to spend too much time, just a introduction overview of what makes a waste potentially a hazardous waste. And we'll look at the difference. For us in California, we actually have two different types of hazardous waste. We have hazardous waste, which are federally regulated, RCRA, and then we have hazardous waste, which are California regulated hazardous waste. We call those non-RCRA hazardous waste. So we'll look at the differences between those two types of hazardous waste, and then once we determine that a waste is a hazardous waste, whether it's a RCRA or non-RCRA hazardous waste, we will then talk about the container and tank management standards. What type of containers we could use, how often containers need to be inspected, how we label them, how long we could store that waste on site. So we'll cover that in container and tank management requirements. And then we'll talk about basic shipping requirements, documentation, records that must be maintained at our facility when we ship hazardous waste off-site to be disposed of or recycled. And then we will conclude the class with some miscellaneous requirements. We'll look at certain wastes, which are hazardous waste, but we have some exceptions or exclusions within the regulations that if we adhere to these exclusions or exceptions within the regulations or statutes, they are not fully regulated or subject to haz waste regulations. So it is a haz waste regulation, but if we manage it accordingly, it's not subject to haz waste regulations. And we'll talk about why that is beneficial to us as a generator. So that's what's in store for you folks today. And again, I know Number one question, parking. On the way out, $15. You don't have to see anyone about a parking pass. You don't have to worry about validation, anything like that. $15 on the way out, you guys are covered. We will take a brief break at about 2:45. And again, if there's any questions, please do not hold back. Feel free to ask. This information is made available to you folks via Orange County and Anaheim Fire Department. So with that, we'll go ahead and begin. Now, quick CUPA overview. The CUPA is the Certified Unified Program Agency. In the CUPA, they are the local agency who's from Orange County. Who here is from Orange County? So Orange County, they're the CUPA, the Environmental Health Department. They are the entity that is responsible for inspecting your business to ensure that you're in compliance with applicable federal, state, local regulations. So the CUPA, they're the inspector. They're the ones who will show up at your facility to make sure you've determined if a waste is a hazardous waste, that waste has been properly managed, that you have the appropriate documentation for disposing or recycling of that hazardous waste. That is the role of the CUPA. So they are a local agency who has the responsibility to enforce federal, state, local regulations. Now the CUPA, they have 6 programs which fall under their authority, their domain, that they hold regulated businesses to. Hazardous waste generators and those facilities that treat hazardous waste, facilities with underground storage tanks, facilities that have hazardous materials, including hazardous waste, on site at certain thresholds that have to submit a hazardous material business plan and chemical inventory, facilities that are subject to the California Accidental Release Program, CalARP, facilities that are subject to the Above Ground Storage Tank Act, and Uniform Fire Code. So those 6 elements fall under the authority of the CUPA. Now today we are only focusing that first bullet, hazardous waste management. So your facility, you may have some additional regulations or statutes that apply to your facility that are enforced by the CUPA, but today we're solely looking at those regulations that affect us as hazardous waste generators. Now, these are some of the most common violations that are discovered by a CUPA inspector when they inspect a facility. So these are things that we want to help you identify, highlight for you folks, so when you get back to your facility, you could potentially, if you have these issues, correct them, so when the inspectors show up, you could avoid these penalties or these fines. By far, the number one violation that is discovered is missing, incorrect, illegible hazardous waste labels. So if we determine we have a waste which is a hazardous waste, we put it in a container or tank, there is very specific information that must be included, written, it has to be legible and visible on the outside of that container or tank. If we're missing any of that information, you can't read it, you can't see it, it's smeared off, that is a violation. So we'll talk about how we properly label containers and tanks. Number 2, container management. And this includes using containers that aren't in good condition or failing to secure or close containers when they're not in use. So if we have a container that holds hazardous waste, it has to be labeled, it has to be closed. We don't label it, it's not securely closed. Those are 2 potential violations. Now, as a generator, we are limited to how long we could store hazardous waste on site. So hazardous waste has a shelf life. Once it's generated, it's placed in a container or tank. We begin accumulating that hazardous waste. We have to ship it off-site dependent on our generator status within a certain time frame. If we exceed that one day, a week, a month, that is another potential violation. So we'll talk about how long, based on our generator status, we can accumulate, store hazardous waste on site. Number 3, improper or failure to make a hazardous waste determination. So we will talk about what makes a waste a hazardous waste. And also, at the conclusion, I'll give you guys a link, provide a link for you folks, where you guys will be able to download a manual that supplements this training. So you guys will have access to this manual reference material, and within this manual, it has detailed information, including lists for what makes a waste a hazardous waste. So you folks will have access to this information. And then number 5, employee training. We'll talk about the training requirements. Again, that is dependent on our generator status. Number 6, failure to conduct container or tank inspections. So not only do we have requirements for labeling, for closure, those containers or tanks that hold hazardous waste also must be inspected. Some instances, the inspections are required to be documented. Some instances, regulations don't require those inspections to be documented. However, if we do an inspection, we don't document it, the CUPA shows up and asks us to prove that we inspected the containers. How are we going to prove to them that we inspected containers? We document it. We document it. So we'll talk about that. Now, failure to segregate incompatible waste, we'll talk about that as well. One thing we cannot do is mix, commingle waste that may react. We can't store those containers together. Now, large quantity generators, we will talk about what makes a generator a large quantity generator in just a second here. If they use a tank for hazardous waste, that tank must be assessed, and the assessment has to be certified by a professional engineer. So if you are a large quantity generator, you have a tank, regardless of size, and we'll look how the regulations define tanks. That tank must be assessed, has to be certified by a professional engineer, and that has to be done at least once every 5 years. And if we don't do that, that's another potential violation. Failure to remove hazardous waste from secondary containment. And this is another big one. So if we use spill pallets, if we have secondary containment around our hazardous waste containers or tanks, if we get residue waste inside that secondary containment, we have to remove that. That may be considered a spill, or that containment at that point, since it contains potentially a hazardous waste, would be subject to container tank management standards. So these are common violations. These are things that we will address, provide you information on, so moving forward, you guys won't potentially be subject to any of these penalties. How about that? One person is excited to hear that. Perfect. All right, let's move on. All right, now generator or producer. Now, if you notice here on the screen, this is a citation from regulations where this information is provided. Now, in California, our hazardous waste regulations are in Title 22, California Code of Regulations. So 22 CCR, that's California Code of Regulations. Now, within Title 22, all of our haz waste regulations are in Division 4.5. And in Chapter 10, Section 66260.10, this is where we find our definitions regarding hazardous waste. So when you see a citation here, this is a citation from regulations. Now, also in California, not only do we have regulations addressing what is, what isn't, exclusions, exemptions, management standards for hazardous waste, we also have statutes within the Health and Safety Code. So we may see those citations appear, and in some cases, state regulations refer us to federal regulations outlined in 40 CFR, California Code, our Code of Federal Regulations, excuse me. So as a generator in California, we have to be able to understand, navigate state regulations, state statutes in the Health and Safety Code, and potentially federal regulations. So as we go through this presentation, if you see this citation, 22 CCR, HSC, 40 CFR, that is just the citation from state regulation, statute, or federal regulations where this information is found. So the first thing we're going to look at is the definition of a generator or producer. And this is important because this is when we have a material that becomes a waste that's determined to be a hazardous waste, and now it is subject to haz waste regulations. Prior to this point, it might have been a hazardous material, not subject to haz waste regulations, so we don't have to adhere to the specific haz waste labeling requirements. We're not limited to storing that waste on site for 90 or 180 days. So we want to look at generator or producer. This is any person by site, and we'll talk about that in 1 second, whose act or process produces a hazardous waste, or whose act first causes a waste to become subject to regulation as hazardous waste. So this is a point, it's no longer a product, it's no longer a material, it's waste, it's hazardous waste. This is when it is now subject to these regulations. So generator or producer. In our facilities, our business, our location, each site that generates or produces hazardous waste, those facilities are called or identified as generators. So your facility, you generate, produce hazardous waste, is considered to be a generator. Now we have 3 different tiers or levels of hazardous waste generators. Conditionally exempt, small, large quantity generators. And conditionally exempt, this is a federal term. This is used by federal EPA. We do have some exclusions for conditionally exempt small quantity generators that we'll talk about. But in California, basically we have large and small quantity generators. If you are conditionally exempt, you have some leniency for transportation disposing in certain instances of hazardous waste. So we have 3 different tiers. Conditionally exempt, small, large quantity generator. And again, it is imperative, your business, your facility that generates hazardous waste, you know what tier you fall into because this affects how long you could store hazardous waste. If you have a hazardous waste tank, do you have to have a tank assessment done? How long that hazardous waste could be stored at your facility? And also, this is important to your bottom line because when you are issued a fee, an invoice from your CUPA to permit or authorize you to store hazardous waste on site, they have a different fee schedule whether you're a large or a small quantity generator. So it affects your pocketbook as well. So facilities that are conditionally exempt, these are companies, businesses that generate 100 kilograms or less of hazardous waste in any calendar month. That's 220 pounds. If we are looking at used oil, who here generates used oil? For used oil, not looking at any other waste stream, that equals about 27 gallons in any calendar month. You generate less than that, conditionally exempt, but that's inclusive of all hazardous waste. If you generate more than 100 kilograms, 220 pounds, but less than 1,000 kilograms, 2,200 pounds, you are then considered to be a small quantity generator. Now, if you generate 2,200 pounds or more in any calendar month, you will be classified as a large quantity generator. If you notice, you're right at the top of the heap, which means if you're a large quantity generator, you have potentially more regulations, more restrictions, more requirements placed on you for accumulating, storing, managing that hazardous waste that you generate. So conditionally exempt small, large quantity generators, 100 kilograms or less, more than 100 kilograms, less than 2,200 pounds, small, 1,000 kilograms or more, you are a large quantity generator. Now, we also have thresholds for acutely or extremely hazardous waste, and we will look at these when we look at waste identification classification. So these are the three different tiers: conditionally exempt, small, large quantity generators. Now, our generator status is based on the volume of hazardous waste, and this is by site that is generated in a calendar month. And that is important because we may have a company, multiple locations. That company as a whole would not be based or determine their generator status based on what is generated at each site. Each independent site would be its own generator. Does that make sense? So if you have a company, 4 sites, 4 different locations, your company as a whole, your generator status is not determined based collectively on what is generated by all 4 sites, but rather each one of those 4 sites independently would have to determine their own generator status. So it's by site, not company, by site. And this is inclusive, and we have that term again, RCRA and non-RCRA hazardous waste. Now, we will look at the differences or how we determine if something is a RCRA hazardous waste. RCRA, that stands for Resource Conservation Recovery Act. These are wastes that are federally regulated. So a RCRA waste is a federally regulated hazardous waste. It could have some factors for compliance at our facility. A non-RCRA hazardous waste is not subject to federal regulations, but it is a hazardous waste in California. Just because we put that term non in front of it doesn't mean it's non-hazardous, doesn't mean it's non-regulated, it just means it is not a federally regulated hazardous waste. But for us, when we accumulate it, we store it, we label it, we put it in a container or tank. For all intents and purposes, the management standards, RCRA, federally regulated, non-RCRA hazardous waste are one and the same. So how we accumulate it, store it, it's not really affected. There are some differences, though, when that waste is offered for transportation. When it's sent off-site to be recycled or disposed of. There are some differences for how RCRA versus non-RCRA hazardous waste are managed. And so it's inclusive of both RCRA and non-RCRA hazardous waste. Now, what is not included to determine our generator status are excluded recyclable materials and universal waste. Now, this term excluded recyclable materials, these are wastes which we have exclusions to recycle, reuse these, introduce these as a feedstock at our facility without first being treated, takes them out of haz waste regulations. But do not get confused because some waste that we generate has to be recycled. So if you generate a hazardous waste, it is sent off site to be recycled, such as used oil, it's still a hazardous waste. That is not an excluded recyclable material. An excluded recyclable material would be a waste that is recycled at the place it is generated. We generate used oil at our facility. We don't recycle it there. We send it off-site to be recycled. So it's recycled, but it's a hazardous waste. It's subject to haz waste regulations. It affects our generator status. So excluded recyclable materials are not included, and then universal wastes are also not included to determine our generator status. Now, we will talk about universal waste streams, and we will talk about the associated management standards for universal waste, because we have RCRA hazardous waste, federally regulated. We have non-RCRA hazardous waste, state regulated. We also have universal waste, which are hazardous waste. However, for these universal wastes, we have special regulations for how they're packaged, labeled, managed, how long we could store those on site. And those regulations for universal waste are the same regardless of our generator status. So when it's a hazardous waste, we have different requirements whether we are a small or a large quantity generator. When it is a universal waste, regardless of our generator status, the rules for how we manage, accumulate, how long we could store those universal wastes on site are one and the same. So we will talk about different universal waste streams and the associated management standards for those universal wastes. So these are the wastes which determine our generator status. Large, small, conditionally exempt. We'll talk about some of the exemptions afforded conditionally exempt small quantity generators, but the container management, labeling, all those requirements that are applicable to small quantity generators within California, the expectation is that conditionally exempt small quantity generators adhere to those requirements. All right, now your facility generates hazardous waste. Your generator, conditionally exempt small, large quantity generator, based on RCRA, non-RCRA hazardous waste, by site, generated in any calendar month. Your facility, each site, not company, each site, each location that generates hazardous waste must have an EPA identification number issued or assigned to their facility. So one thing that you have to have as a hazardous waste generator is that you have to have an EPA ID number for your facility. Now this is a unique number that is tied to your location, your site, not your company. Your company moves, you go to a different location, that number does not follow you. You would have to have a new number issued at your new site, your new location. So each generator, by site, each facility has to have its own unique EPA ID number. Now this is one reason we have to know RCRA versus non-RCRA hazardous waste, because there are two different types of EPA ID numbers, but we only need one. And it is determined what type of EPA ID number we need has to be applied or affixed to our facility based on the volume of RCRA hazardous waste that is generated. Because what EPA says is that if you generate more than 220 pounds of RCRA hazardous waste in any calendar month, you can't use a state EPA ID number, you have to use a federal EPA ID number. But EPA says if you generate less than 220 pounds of RCRA hazardous waste, you don't even need an EPA ID number. But California says all generators must have an EPA ID number. So either we have a federal number or a state number. We need just one. But it is based on the volume of RCRA hazardous waste that is generated. Now these numbers, 12-digit numbers, they're preceded by one of these prefixes. And that just identifies whether it is issued by EPA or issued by the state. Now we have the CUPA, our local agency. They inspect us, ensure we're in compliance with applicable federal, state, local regulations. Now, California, we have Cal EPA. The branch that enforces hazardous waste regulations is the Department of Toxic Substances Control. So they are the state agency that issues these EPA ID numbers. The federal numbers come from EPA. Your facility, you only need one. And when you ship out hazardous waste, that EPA ID number must be active. And that is important because as a generator, annually, you have to verify with the state that your number is active. And there may be fees associated with this verification. based on number of employees, the number of manifests that were generated during the prior year. Now, the verifications for your site, each site that generates hazardous waste, are done electronically. And here's the link that you could go to, set up an account to verify that number. And if you fail to do so, DTSC isn't going to fine you. All they're going to do is deactivate your EPA ID number. Then your haz waste transporter shows up. They pick up hazardous waste. They use your EPA ID number, which has been deactivated. They ship out hazardous waste. You could be fined for that. You could be cited for that because you have to have an active EPA ID number when you ship that hazardous waste off for disposal. So all generators, each site, conditionally exempt small, large quantity generators, must have an EPA ID number issued to their facility. Now, some additional requirements. Each facility also must have contingency plans or procedures in case there is a spill, incident, fire, explosion involving hazardous waste. Now, we have different requirements for small, which includes conditionally exempt, and large quantity generators. Large quantity generators must have a written contingency plan. Is anyone here a large quantity generator? Okay, so you folks at your facility, you have to have a written contingency plan. And when the CUPA shows up, when your inspector shows up, they're going to look at two things for your facility. They're going to look at your records, your documents, your contingency plan, training program, and they're going to look at your facility, how you manage, accumulate, store hazardous waste. And if you're a large quantity generator, they'll request to see a copy of that contingency plan. So large quantity generators must have this document, and included in that document, you have to identify emergency coordinator. You have to include the procedures that will be undertaken, followed in case there's a spill, release, fire, explosion. So that has to be included in the contingency plan. Services and arrangements to coordinate response procedures. So if you have any outside contractors that you utilize, you have to identify that in there. Emergency equipment that you have on site for responses, an evacuation plan, and a contact for the California Office of Emergency Services. So this information must be included in your contingency plan. You have to have it, written, standalone document. So large quantity generators, you have to have this. Now, small quantity generators, we don't need this formal written contingency plan. But what small quantity generators must have is a person on site or available at all times in case there is an incident, fire, explosion, spill, whatever the case is, involving hazardous waste. This person is identified as the emergency coordinator. So those of us who are not large quantity generators, we don't have to put together a contingency plan, but we have to have someone, probably a backup or two, because these folks have to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in case there's an incident, and these folks are identified as an emergency coordinator. Now, not only do we have to identify emergency coordinator, alternate emergency coordinators, we also have to post their name, contact number, location of fire extinguishers, spill control equipment, number for the local fire department near telephones. So this information has to be posted near telephones within our facility. Now, there is a form that has blocks, spaces, that we could populate with this information, post it near telephones, small quantity generators. We have met those contingency plan requirements. So you have to have this posted near telephones at your facility. Now, tank assessments. Who here uses a tank to accumulate, store hazardous waste in? We have almost 500 people and there's 4 people. I don't believe that. Who uses a tank to accumulate, store? Okay. Of those people who use a tank, store hazardous waste, who's a large quantity generator? Okay, perfect. So if you have a tank, large quantity generator, this is one of those common violations. You have to have a tank assessment done, has to be certified by EPA. This has to be completed every 5 years. If you're a small quantity generator, you have a tank, you put hazardous waste in a tank, you don't have to have a tank assessment done. Doesn't have to be certified by EPA. This is only applicable to large quantity generators. So this is a written document where a PE will look at your tank, what type of waste we put in the tank, the estimated remaining service life of that tank, all the ancillary equipment, secondary containment, etc., and they'll put together a report and they will actually certify or stamp that report. Required for large quantity generators. If you're a small quantity generator, you have a tank, you don't need to have a tank assessment done. So that is something that is required for large quantity generators. Now, another requirement for large quantity generators, but this only affects RCRA large quantity generators. So if you generate RCRA hazardous waste, 1,000 kilograms, 2,200 pounds or more in any calendar month, you are subject to biennial reporting. However, this is only every other year. So if last year, 2015, your facility generated 2,200 pounds of RCRA hazardous waste in a calendar month, by March 1st of this year, you have to submit a biennial report. Doesn't matter how much RCRA hazardous waste we generate this year, we don't have to do any reporting. This only affects us in odd number years. So if in an odd number year, your facility generates 2,200 pounds or more of a RCRA hazardous waste or an acutely hazardous waste, more than 2.2 pounds, we'll talk about that, then you're subject to biennial reporting. If you're a large quantity generator, but it's because of non-RCRA hazardous waste, you don't have to submit your biennial report. So that's only for RCRA large quantity generators. Now, other documents, records that we want to retain, this is regardless of our generator status. You want to make sure these records are maintained available at your facility. Any records you have for the disposal or recycling of hazardous waste, RCRA and non-RCRA hazardous waste. You want to maintain these documents, keep these records on file. These records must be maintained for 3 years. And this is one thing inspectors will look at. And this is one thing inspectors typically look at to determine what our generator status is. Because most generators, when we put waste in a container or tank, we don't have a log, we don't have a checklist. We don't mark off how much waste on each particular day was added to that container or tank. Hello? I forgot to mention, if you would put your phones on silence, that would be greatly appreciated. At least you weren't sleeping. So, typically, we do not have a log to track how much hazardous waste we generate, so what is used is these disposal or recycle manifest records that we have on site. These records, we have to maintain these for 3 years from data shipment, and we will talk about the manifest system when we talk about those basic shipping requirements. Now, you also want to retain LDR. LDR are land disposal restriction forms. Now, this is one thing that is different between RCRA versus non-RCRA hazardous waste. Federally regulated hazardous waste are land disposal restricted waste. So when we ship those wastes off-site, in addition to the manifest form that we have to use, we'll have a second document, an LDR form, that may be included with that shipment. Has to be included with the initial shipment. So this LDR form, we have to retain these forms for 3 years as well. All RCRA hazardous wastes are land disposal restricted. Not all non-RCRA, there's a few categories: asbestos-containing waste, foundry sand, aqueous waste with metals. Those wastes are land disposal restricted. So certain non-RCRA hazardous waste, you may have an LDR form, hold on to it for 3 years. RCRA hazardous wastes are all land disposal restricted, hold on to that LDR form for 3 years as well. So those are additional documents, records that we have to maintain. Now, some other records that we want to maintain, make available, provide to an inspector upon request is any waste analytical or testing that we have done on our waste. So if we have a waste, we'll talk about how we could determine if that waste is or isn't a hazardous waste. One of the ways we could do that is we could actually test it. So if we test it, and testing shows it is or it isn't a hazardous waste, we want to keep that documentation. We want to maintain that record at our facility. SB 14 documents, this is required for large quantity generators. There are certain waste streams that are excluded. This is regardless whether it's RCRA or non-RCRA hazardous waste. The biennial reporting, those are federal requirements. SB 14, these are state requirements. This is done once every 4 years, and it is based on the volume of hazardous waste that we generate in a reporting year. Last reporting year was 2014. Documents had to be prepared by September of 2015. So the next reporting year that may affect us, 2018. Documents prepared by September of 2019. Any correspondence we get from our regulators, make sure you retain that. Keep that on file at your facility. And if you get a request notification from your inspectors or your CUPA, do not ignore it. Because in some cases, it may have a timeline or a deadline or a due date that is included on there. Hey, we're giving you this notification. You have 30 days to correct this. You know what happens if you don't correct it within 30 days? Potential violation. Maybe they'll send you another, hey, we told you once, this is your final notice, you have 15 days. You don't correct it, you ignore it, that's when you potentially could be subject to penalties or fines. So make sure you maintain that information. Then also your container and tank inspections. We'll talk about these container and tank inspections. We actually have a sample form that you could use to accomplish these inspections. You want to make sure that you keep these records on file for 3 years at your facility. This is a way that we show or we demonstrate to an inspector what we are doing, what's been implemented at our facility to maintain compliance with these regulations. So you want to keep these records available. And these records will be requested by an inspector. They will be reviewed by an inspector. We don't have them, they're missing, they're incomplete. We could have done everything correct. That still could result in a violation or a penalty. So make sure you maintain these records on site at your facility. All right, now training requirements. The reason that we're here. Hazardous waste generators must train employees, facility personnel, that generate hazardous waste as part of their job duty or affect compliance at our facility. So if your business generates hazardous waste, you have employees that generate, handle, manage, affect compliance with hazardous waste regulations, employees must be trained. We have different training requirements for small quantity generators as opposed to large quantity generators. The good news for you folks, everyone from Orange County, Anaheim, when you guys leave today, you guys will get a completion certificate. This training program satisfies all the elements most inspectors are looking for employees who generate, handle, manage hazardous waste, with one exception. Not only do employees have to be aware of those specific requirements for handling hazardous waste, they also have to know what to do in case of an emergency. Large quantity generators have to be trained. Employees, facility personnel, must be trained on their contingency plan. Small quantity generators must know what to do in case of a spill release. So the one element that you guys will have to supplement this training with at your facility is go through, what do we do in case there's a spill? Where are our spill kits located? Who is the emergency coordinator? Who do we notify? How do we evacuate? What exits do we use? Where do we assemble at our facility? So all the elements we're covering today covers everything that is required, with the one exception, the contingency plan elements that your facility would be subject to. Now, universal waste, we'll talk about universal waste. And universal waste are hazardous waste, but we have our own management standards separate from hazardous waste management standards spelled out in Title 22. So we'll talk about those management standards. Now, regulations say that employees who manage universal waste also must be trained. Not employees that generate universal waste or handle universal waste, but those employees who manage universal waste. Package, respond to releases, move containers, prepare those containers for shipment. So those employees must be trained. And then in some instances, we also may have employees that are subject to DOT hazmat employee training. Because when we have a hazardous waste and we prepare that hazardous waste for transportation, not only is it subject to state, potentially federal EPA regulations, but it may also be considered a hazardous material by DOT. So when it is on a public roadway, it's a hazardous material, and those employees who package it, prepare it, sign a manifest, they are considered to be a DOT hazmat employee. So you may have some employees that also have to have DOT hazmat employee training. So these are three areas, topics that could affect you, employees, facility personnel. Now, small quantity generators. Small quantity generators must train employees specific to their job duties and not required in regulations to provide recurrent or refresher training. So if you're a small quantity generator, you train your employees, you don't have to do any sort of refresher, recurrent training, nor do regulations require us to document that training. However, if you don't document it, how do you prove it was done, right? So you want to make sure it's documented. So small quantity generators must provide training specific to employees' job duties. Now, large quantity generators, we have more stringent training requirements spelled out in state regulations. If you're a large quantity generator, facility personnel must be trained within 6 months of hire or job placement. They have to be trained annually thereafter. Training also has to be documented. So you have to document the training. You have to train them relevant to their position handling that hazardous waste, as well as the provisions within your contingency plan. What constitutes an emergency? Implementing the contingency plan. How responses will be handled within the facility. And has to be documented. You have to identify the employees, job titles, and job duties for those employees. And you have to keep records, current facility personnel, until the facility closes. And this is called or referred to as a training plan. So if you're a large quantity generator, you have to have a training plan. You do it within 6 months of hire. Annually thereafter, you identify job duties, titles, and what elements they've been covered. That is your training plan. That is the documentation that you have to retain, keep on file, provide to an inspector at your facility. And here's an example of a form, a document that we could use to record training for our employees. So this is a means for us to demonstrate that employees have been trained. And again, everyone in attendance today, you guys are going to get a certificate. So you've been trained, everything you need to know, with the exception what to do at your facility in case there is a spill release. We completed section 1. Any questions? Not a single question. 95% of you folks have never been exposed to this, seen this information. Yes, sir.
On the tanks that you talked about, do portable tanks count in that as well?
No. Tanks, stationary tanks, and we will specifically, per regulations, define the difference between a container, including a portable tank, and a tank. Good question. There was a question in the back. One more time. No. Large quantity. Is it a bathroom break time? Large quantity generators, small quantity generators, we don't have the same management standards, accumulation time limits that apply to our facility. Large quantity generators, tank assessments, not required for small quantity generators. Large quantity generators, you have to train your employees annually within 6 months of hire. Small quantity generators, you have to train them specific to their job duties. So the requirements are not one and the same, and there will be some differences when we talk about how we manage our containers and tanks that hold hazardous waste from small to large quantity generators. So the standards are not the same. What is the same is the labeling, accumulation time limits for RCRA and non-RCRA hazardous waste. Yes. Correct. Correct. So if you're conditionally exempt for how long you could accumulate and store that waste, you have no set time period until you hit 220 pounds. Then your clock starts and you have 180 days. Correct. Yep. Yes. If you're borderline, that is when you want to maybe keep a track, log the waste that you generate, whether you put it in a container or tank. Because if you're borderline and if you don't definitively track how much waste you generate, the only means to determine how much waste you generated is when an inspector looks up, they look at your disposal records, your manifest, and whatever quantity or volumes that were placed on there that you signed off on by your transporter, that is how they will determine your generator status. So if you have a transporter, they pump out your used oil tank, it's 200 gallons, you have 100 gallons in there, they write 200 gallons on the receipt, the inspector's gonna say, no, you generated 200 gallons, it says so right here. So you just wanna keep good records with the volume or amount of hazardous waste you generate. Yes, ma'am. You generate excluded recyclable material. Okay. Now, excluded recyclable materials, 25143.2, it gives us what waste we can manage and some treatment standards that we could use. Now, in 25143.9, those are the management standards for excluded recyclable materials, and they are one and the same as the hazardous waste management standards. With one exception, when we label them, we don't include the word hazardous waste, we include the word excluded recyclable material. So if you manage that excluded recyclable material in a tank, it's subject to the tank management standards spelled out in Title 22. So it is subject. The benefit to you, it doesn't affect your generator status. You don't have to pay to dispose of it, et cetera. You get to recycle it on site, but for the management standards, it is one and the same essentially as the haz waste container tank management standards. Yes, sir. What? Yes. Yes, you have to report every 2 years if you recycle more than 100 kilograms of a excluded recyclable material per year, or monthly, excuse me. In that reporting is now done within CERS. So when you log into CERS, it will ask you, do you recycle more than 100 kilograms? You mark yes. It will give you a report to fill out and complete. So yeah, you do have to notify the CUPA that you're doing that. So you do have to report that. You must have excluded recyclable materials. Okay. Well, thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
There's two forms that showed up there, and one was the emergency contact list.
Yes.
Employee training documentation. That will be included in the downloadable package.
Those are not included in this manual, but if you go to Unidocs, UNIDOCS, you'll be able to find both of those forms. That's where I downloaded those forms for. They are not trademark protected, patented, anything like that, so you could download and use those, absolutely, absolutely. Any other? Oh, good question. So some incident, we increase our volume. Now, it depends. The CUPA, they're required, you have a business plan to inspect your facility at least once every 3 years. They may inspect your facility more frequently than that. So in some cases, if we do increase the volume of hazardous waste, it's determined based on those manifest disposal records. We're reclassified by the CUPA. They may never reclassify us until we notify them. Usually, though, you're captured for the next 12 months. But again, if they don't show up, if they don't reclassify you, if they send you out your annual invoice and say, hey, here's your permit fees and you're a large quantity generator, what I would recommend at that point, notify them, say, hey, previously I was a large quantity generator, but we have been below that threshold. I have records, documents to prove it. Please reclassify me, which is to your benefit because then it saves on fees and the management standards at your facility. There's one other question. Yes? Correct. That's it? Okay. That was it. Yes? If you have what?
Multiple sites, and the waste that's generated by one site, do the documentation have to be kept on that site, or like the headquarters?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would recommend the site that generates a hazardous waste, that manages a hazardous waste, that you have those documents there. Now, maybe not the original documents, maybe you keep those at headquarters, but if you have copies, electronic copies, scanned copies, you want to be able, when the inspector shows up and asks you for them, you want to be able to present those, duplicate, provide those forms for them at that time, Good question. Was there a question over here? No other questions?
I have a question on excluded recyclable material.
Yes.
To be considered an excluded recyclable material, somebody has to make a determination that the material is waste, right?
True.
Okay. I'm in an industry that recover gasoline from cars.
Okay.
And we put it in above ground tank. Some counties will say that it should be excluded recyclable material, and some counties will say if you put it as recovered material, then it's not excluded recyclable material.
Okay.
But we don't recycle, we sell it as gasoline.
So you sell it as a fuel.
As fuel.
You don't treat it, you don't do anything to it to change it. You remove it from a fuel tank, put it in an above ground tank, you sell it. How much per gallon?
No, we sell it to volume wholesalers.
Okay.
And now, again, some counties will say you should make that as an excluded recyclable material and use their forms. We said, it's not a waste. Because one time we did it, and this county is saying that, hey, how will you say that it's excluded when
It's not a waste? Yeah. Yeah. Now that is where there could be some disconnect because these regulations, I mean, there's always room for interpretation in different CUPAs, different counties, cities, fire departments. In some cases, they have different interpretations. In some cases, so certain county may request one thing that another county doesn't. But yeah, for an excluded recyclable material, it has to be a waste to be exempted from being considered a hazardous waste. If it's not a waste, how are you going to exclude it from being a hazardous waste, right? So, yeah. That just sounded like a war story, not a question.
Well, the thing is, and the reason why I asked
I'm kidding.
is the thing is, we were inspected by the state.
Okay.
And there was a sign in our tank, hey, it's excluded recyclable material.
In the state, so what are you doing?
We're
Okay,
not, you're not
okay.
recycling, it's not
Okay.
a waste, so it should be.
So the CUPA wanted you to manage it as a ERM, and DTSC said it's not a waste, so it is not subject to any HAZ waste standards or any of the exclusions in the health and safety code. Yeah, I would agree with that because it has to be a waste before it is a hazardous waste, right? Was there some other questions back here? All the way in the back. For the rest of the session, can you please repeat the question? Yes. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Satellite locations, we're going to talk about that when we talk about container and tank management standards. Satellite locations will be talked about when we look at container and tank management standards. So, all right, no other questions. We will move on. Making a hazardous waste determination, this is imperative, this is important for all of us. Because we have to determine, one, if it's a waste, and if it is a waste, we are responsible, generator is responsible, per regulations to determine if that waste is or isn't a hazardous waste. Because this is where it will potentially be subject to these regulations. Could affect our generator status. We have those specific labeling requirements. We have to ship it off-site on a manifest form. So we'll look at making a hazardous waste determination. Again, the manual that you guys will have access to, this information is all included in Chapter 3 of this manual. So I'll give you guys a link so you could download this information. Now, we could probably easily spend 4+ hours on this section. This section, excuse me. That is not the intent, but we do want you to understand what is, what isn't, where we have some exclusions or exemptions for certain waste that we can manage that pulls them out of the haz waste arena, and the difference between RCRA and non-RCRA hazardous waste. Because this could affect disposal costs, transportation requirements, etc. And if we solely rely on our contractor, our transporter, our consultant, and they misclassify or mischaracterize our waste, guess who's at fault? Not them, us. It falls back on us. So we'll look at making a hazardous waste determination. So the regulations state, 262.11, a person who generates a waste, will define how the state defines a waste in 1 second, shall determine if the waste is hazardous by seeing if it's excluded from regulation. So we have some exclusions and regulations. We have exclusions within the Health and Safety Code for excluded recyclable materials. If it's excluded, then it's not a hazardous waste. We then would look to see if the waste is listed. If it's excluded, it's not a hazardous waste. If it's listed, it could be a hazardous waste. Or if the waste exhibits a characteristic of a hazardous waste. So as a generator, we have a waste we have to determine, is there an exclusion or an exemption for this waste? If there's not, then we want to determine, see if it is a listed hazardous waste. It may not be listed, but it's still a hazardous waste because it exhibits a characteristic of a hazardous waste. Now, these determinations can be made one of two ways. We could test that waste. Some cases we may have to. Some cases we may have to, so we could test that waste, analyze it. And again, if we test sample, we get analytical back, we make a determination using that route, retain, hold on to that documentation, because that is what we could show an inspector, either from the state or our CUPA, how we made our hazardous waste determination. Or we could use generator's knowledge. So we could use knowledge. I know that this waste is excluded. I know this waste is listed. I know that this waste exhibits these characteristics. So those are the two ways that we can make a hazardous waste determination. Now, this is how waste is defined within California. Waste, any discarded material of any form, liquid, semi-solid, solid, or gaseous, that is not excluded by regulation or statute. So waste is a discarded material, regardless what form, liquid, sludge, gas, solid, that is not excluded by regulation or statute. Now, these bullets here, this is how we define discarded. If that waste is relinquished, disposed, burned, accumulated, stored prior to or in lieu of disposal, that's a waste. If it is applied to the land in a manner constituting disposal, if it's inherently waste-like, these last two bullets, these are something you have to be aware of. Because we could have a product, a material, but by the fact that it is not labeled, mislabeled, or in a damaged container, it could go from a product to a discarded material, which makes it a waste. So if we have a container, mislabeled, not properly labeled, and this material presents a hazard to health or the environment, and it is not corrected within, the labeling is not corrected within 10 days of being discovered, that material automatically becomes discarded, which makes it a waste. Or if we have a material that's in a container that's damaged, and that container is not repackaged within 96 hours, 4 days, then that material, it's no longer a material, it's discarded, it becomes waste. So this is one thing that you want to consider. We may have products, materials, things that we're using at our facility which may be determined to be a waste if they're not properly labeled or if the containers are damaged. So a new product, good product, may be considered or presumed to be a waste. All right, now here's some exclusions from the regulations. So these exclusions are found in 66261.4. And these are exclusions for materials which are not waste. And then waste, which are not hazardous waste. Now these are state exclusions. In federal regulations for materials which are not waste, we have about 20 of them. You can see our list is much more abbreviated for us in California. So materials which are not waste. Industrial wastewater discharges, not a waste. Nuclear byproducts, spent sulfuric acid used to produce virgin sulfuric acid in secondary materials which are returned to their original processes are not a waste. Now, a secondary material that is returned, it goes back to the original process, it has to be stored in a tank, and it has to be returned to the original process in a closed loop system. So it can't be a pit, open sump, anything like that. But those secondary materials are not waste. Now, waste, which are not hazardous waste, includes infectious waste, materials which are not classified as solid waste that don't exhibit a characteristic of a hazardous waste, used oil, distillation bottoms, and then CFCs that are recycled. Those wastes are not hazardous waste. So these are exclusions. Now, we also have some exclusions for excluded recyclable materials. Those are spelled out in the Health and Safety Code in section 25143.2. So we do have some exclusions. Hey, we could recycle, we could reuse this on site. Those materials would not be considered waste either. Now, if it is a waste, not excluded by regulation or statute, then we have to determine if it is a hazardous waste. And again, we could do that by seeing if it is on a list, or that must be an important phone call. Go ahead, take it. No? Okay. Or if it exhibits the characteristic of a hazardous waste. Now on the screen here, RCRA to the left, those are federally regulated hazardous waste. Now if we determine we have a waste and it is considered a federally regulated hazardous waste, guess what that waste is in California? It's a hazardous waste. So if we determine, hey, this waste, it's on this list, or it exhibits this characteristic, it's a hazardous waste. We're done. We're done. Federally regulated, it's regulated in California. Now, if we determine our waste is not a RCRA hazardous waste, doesn't appear on one of these lists, doesn't exhibit one of these characteristics, maybe it's not defined as a hazardous waste by EPA, then what we have to do is determine, is it a California non-RCRA hazardous waste? So in California, like EPA, we have lists and we have characteristic waste. So if we determine our waste is not a RCRA, federally regulated hazardous waste, then what we have to do is determine if it's a non-RCRA hazardous waste. Now for us, RCRA, non-RCRA, they both affect our generator status. RCRA, though, we may be subject to biennial reporting. We may have to have a federal EPA ID number as opposed to a state EPA ID number. We ship those RCRA hazardous waste off for disposal. They will always be regulated by DOT as a hazardous material in their land disposal restricted waste. Non-RCRA hazardous waste, we have container tank management standards, accumulation time periods, not subject to biennial reports, don't have to have a federal EPA ID number, not always regulated by DOT, nor are all non-RCRA hazardous waste land disposal restricted. So we'll go through the mechanics. We'll look at these different lists. We'll look at these different characteristics, both to determine if a waste is RCRA. If it's not a RCRA, then we'll determine if it is a non-RCRA hazardous waste. All right. So RCRA listed waste. EPA has 4 different lists. And if your waste that you generate is on any one of these lists, guess what you have? A RCRA hazardous waste. Of course, there's always some exceptions to the rules. But if it's on a list, it is a listed hazardous waste. Now, we have 4 lists. They're separated into 2 different categories. We have lists for waste that are spent or used. So they're spent. We use them in a process. They're contaminated. They've been used for their intended purpose. We have 2 lists for those spent waste. And then we have lists for waste that are not spent or not used. Why would we ever dispose of a material, a product that hasn't been used as a waste? Expired? Could be expired. It could be surplus material. Some cases it could be cleanup from a spill. Maybe an empty container. So in some cases we may have expired products, surplus material, new. We don't have a need for them. We have to determine we're not going to use these any longer. We're going to get rid of them. They're not used. Then we would consult 2 lists to determine if it is a RCRA hazardous waste. So the first 2 lists, F and K listed waste. These are the lists that we would consult, that we would look at if we have a waste that was spent. It was used. It was mixed, contaminated. Can we use this material? Now it's a waste. We can't use it any longer. We can't recycle it on site, not excluded under 25143.2. Let's check out these lists and see if it appears on these lists. Now the first list, F listed waste, these are called non-process specific waste. So it doesn't matter what industry we're from, we may potentially generate a F listed waste. Now, these F-listed wastes are broken up into different categories. We have listed waste for spent solvent waste. We have listed waste for metal treatment. We have listed waste for dioxin-containing waste, hydrocarbon waste, petroleum wastewaters, leachate waste. So we will look at this list, and if it appears on that list, and that list tells us this is a waste, in some cases, it is not based on the concentration after use for solvents, but before use concentration. And if it's there, it has an associated waste code, and that waste code will be preceded by an F. So if you look at your manifest, or you look at your haz waste label, when your container of hazardous waste is being shipped off-site, if there's a F001, F027, you have a F-listed waste, non-process specific waste. Those F-listed wastes are included in the handout that you guys will have access to. You could also find those in regulations 66261.31. You have those F-listed wastes. Now, if it is a specific process, we would consult or look at the K-listed wastes. And these K-listed wastes are from very finite, very specific processes from specific industries. Wood preservation, organic chemicals, inorganic chemicals, veterinarian products, explosives. And if we have specific processes that generate this listed waste, that is a K-listed waste. So we have that information. That is also available to us within Title 22, 66261.32. So we have those lists there. Use waste. Now you'll notice we only have a couple hundred listed spent or used waste. So it's not all inclusive. That's when we'll circle back around to our characteristic waste. Now for our unspent waste, we have two different lists. P-listed waste and U-listed waste. Sir, you probably could not look more bored if you tried. I was wrong. You look more bored. P and U-listed waste. Now, P-listed waste, these are called acutely hazardous waste. And if your facility, you could generate less than 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste, but if you generate 2.2 pounds or more than 2.2 pounds of an acutely hazardous waste in a calendar month, you're automatically a large quantity generator. So these P-listed waste, these are acutely hazardous waste. U-listed waste, these are hazardous waste. Now, for something to be a P or U-listed waste, it has to meet a couple of criteria. One, can't be used. So if you have this material, you use it, it will never carry a P or U code. So it has to be unused. And those P and U lists, that has to be the sole active ingredient. So if you look at your label, you look at your safety data sheet, it has the chemical constituents, and there's multiple hazardous constituents. It will never be a P or U listed waste because it has to be the sole active ingredient. Now, EPA, they use the term technical grade, so they don't define what concentration of these P or U listed waste other than it's a technical grade off-spec commercial chemical product. So it has to be unused, has to be the sole active ingredient. Now, that code also could apply. We have that material, we spill it, we contain it, we clean it up. That cleanup would also carry a P or U code. In any container that previously held one of these listed wastes, that container would carry that P code unless it was triple rinse cleaned out, which may require a permit. So it has to be the sole active ingredient. Can't be used. PU code applies to the spill cleanup, empty container unless it's been triple rinsed. So EPA, I mean, it's pretty easy. You look at these lists. Spent, we have a couple lists to look at. Unspent, we have a couple lists to look at. If it's a sole active ingredient, hasn't been used, whatever the case is. And if it's on either of these lists, it's a list of hazardous waste. There are some exceptions, but for most part, it is a list of hazardous waste. Now this, again, is not all inclusive. So this is where we may have a waste, doesn't appear on any list, but it exhibits the characteristic of a hazardous waste. So if it exhibits a characteristic of a hazardous waste, it would also be considered a hazardous waste. Now, these wastes, P, U, F, and K, the EPA waste code associated with them is preceded by that associated letter. If it's on a P list, P029. U list, U002. F list, F003. K list, K141. So the waste code is preceded by that letter. Now, our characteristic waste, EPA RCRA characteristic waste, we have 4 types of characteristic waste. These wastes are preceded, the waste code preceded by the letter D. Now, the first type of characteristic waste is ignitable characteristic waste. If we have a liquid other than an aqueous solution that has less than 24% alcohol by volume, that has a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit, that liquid is considered to be an ignitable characteristic waste. So how do we test that, determine if that liquid has a flash point less than 140 degrees? Lighter. Orange County, I'm not going to tell you that answer came from waste management. Not a lighter. There is a test that could be done in a laboratory where they test, or maybe we could refer back to the safety data sheet, right? Because we could use wow, this material has a flash point of negative 73 degrees. We're not diluting it. It's not being mixed with any water or anything that's not flash. So our assumption is it exhibits this characteristic before and after use. So we may be able to use generator's knowledge. So liquid, based on flash point, if it is a solid ignited by friction, absorption of moisture, undergoes spontaneous chemical change and burns vigorously, it is then considered to be an ignitable characteristic waste. So it could be a solid. Now, this test is a little more arbitrary. There are tests where you could test burn rate, etc., but this is a little more arbitrary. So it could be a liquid, low flash point, solid, ignited by friction, absorption of moisture, whatever the case is, or if it is an ignitable compressed gas. So if you have a compressed gas that ignites when it is mixed with air at a volume of 13% or less, that is an ignitable characteristic waste. Or if you have a compressed gas and it will ignite when mixed with air, there's a range between the lower flammable limit and the upper flammable limit of at least 12, that ignitable compressed gas is considered a characteristic waste. However, this is one area. California is less stringent than EPA because this definition for an ignitable compressed gas, who generates aerosol cans? No one who generates aerosol cans? Aerosol cans may meet this definition, right? Could have butane, it could have a flammable propellant, so it could meet that definition. So aerosol cans are an ignitable characteristic waste. However, in California, we can manage those as universal waste. So we manage those as universal waste. We don't have to apply D001 code. Doesn't affect our generator status. So that is one area we are less stringent than EPA. Now, if it is an oxidizer, it involves oxygen, it's a organic compound, peroxide, then it would also be considered an ignitable characteristic waste. So it could be a liquid based on flash point, could be a solid based on its ability to burn, could be a compressed gas, or an oxidizer. So any one of these can make a waste an ignitable characteristic waste. Those wastes will have a D001 applied to them. Now, corrosive characteristic waste, these wastes will have a D002. Now, EPA only regulates aqueous and liquids as corrosive characteristic waste. If you have an aqueous solution, which just means it has water in it, and that aqueous solution has a pH of 2 or less, or 12.5 or more, it is a corrosive characteristic waste. D002 is applied to that waste. If it is a liquid that corrodes still at a rate of 1/4 inch per year, then it is a corrosive characteristic waste, D002. So again, that's pretty easy to determine, right? We may be able to use a safety data sheet. We could use a pH meter, pH strips, litmus paper, and kind of determine, hey, is this acidic? Is this basic? pH 2 or less, pH 12.5 or more, corrosive characteristic waste. Now the next category, reactive characteristic waste. These wastes will have a D003 code. These wastes react with water, form toxic mixtures, flammable mixtures, cyanide sulfide-bearing waste between pH 2 12.5, forbidden explosives. These are reactive wastes. These have a D003. Now the last type of characteristic wastes are toxicity characteristic wastes. These wastes will have a D code, D004 through D043. And there are 40 contaminants, 8 inorganic, 32 organic, that can make a waste a toxicity characteristic waste. Now, for these toxicity characteristic wastes, it's not like our PRU listed wastes, which are acutely hazardous to us or hazardous to us. These are wastes that fail a test called the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure, and based on a specific threshold, if it's above that threshold, it is a RCRA hazardous waste. Equal to that threshold, it's a RCRA hazardous waste. Below that threshold, it's not a RCRA hazardous waste. So to determine if your waste is a toxicity characteristic waste, RCRA, you have a table, 40 contaminants. There is a regulatory threshold. That threshold is based on the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure. Equals or fails, you have a result greater than that, it is a hazardous waste. Below that, it is not a RCRA hazardous waste. So this may be something that actually requires analytical. We may be able to use generator knowledge. We have contaminants that appear on that table. We can apply those waste codes, but in some cases, we may be over-characterizing that waste, which could affect us because that affects our disposal options, transportation costs, and potentially our disposal costs. So those are RCRA hazardous waste. So if we go through these mechanics, oh, it's on the list. Oh, it's ignitable. It's corrosive. We're done. Because if we determine our waste is a RCRA hazardous waste, it is automatically regulated in California. Now, if we go through these different lists, these different characteristics, our waste isn't on there. What isn't represented on any of these 4 lists or by these 4 characteristics is one thing that most of us probably generate. Used oil, right? It's not ignitable, not corrosive, not reactive, not toxic, doesn't appear on any list, but in California, it is a hazardous waste. Not federally, but in California, it's a hazardous waste. So California, we have 2 lists as well. The difference with these lists, EPA says your waste appears on any of those 4 lists, it is a hazardous waste. Our lists that we have in California are called presumptive waste. You know what that means? It is presumed to be a hazardous waste until we, as a generator, prove that it isn't a hazardous waste. So we have 2 lists. First list, common names of waste. And these are generic names of waste streams that are presumed to be a hazardous waste. And California says they're presumed to be a hazardous waste because they may exhibit the characteristic of ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity, based on California's definitions, not EPA. In some examples from the common names of waste that are presumed to be a hazardous waste in California: oil and water, paint waste, laboratory waste, alkaline cleaners. Those are all presumed to be a hazardous waste. So if we generate those wastes, we have to be able to determine if it is or isn't a hazardous waste, and we have to be able to support that determination when an inspector asks us. Now, above and beyond this list of common names of waste, we also have a list of chemicals that create a hazardous waste. Now, there are 791 chemicals listed on this list. In California, it says that chemical is one of the constituents in your waste stream. That entire waste stream is presumed to be a hazardous waste because it may be ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic. May not be a hazardous waste, but we have to prove that as a generator. So we have this list of chemicals, which include hydrogen peroxide, muriatic acid, these different chemical constituents, part of the waste stream. If they exhibit those associated characteristics, it is presumed to be a hazardous waste. On a list, it's a hazardous waste, EPA list. On one of these lists, our California list, common names, chemicals that create a hazardous waste, it is presumed to be a hazardous waste. In these lists, guess where you're going to have access to these lists? No. Title 22, you have access to these lists, but they'll also be included in your handout. They'll be included in your handout. Now, California, above and beyond our presumptive waste, we also have characteristic waste. EPA has 4 types of characteristic waste. California has 4 types of characteristic waste as well: ignitable, corrosive, reactive, toxic. However, we do not always use the same definition as EPA. Now, ignitable characteristic waste, California uses the same exact definition. So if we determine our waste is ignitable because it meets this definition, yeah, it's a RCRA hazardous waste. California also agrees to that. Now, for our corrosive characteristic waste, we agree with EPA, aqueous solution, pH 2 or less, 12.5 or more, or a liquid that corrodes steel, but California also regulates non-aqueous, non-liquids if you mix that waste with equal parts water and it exhibits either of those characteristics. So in California, we may regulate salts, powders, tablets that EPA wouldn't. You mix them with water, they have pH 2 or less, 12.5 or more. California would call that a corrosive characteristic waste. Now, our reactive waste, we have the same exact definition. California also calls these extremely hazardous waste. EPA uses that term, acutely hazardous waste, for those P lists of waste. California calls these extremely hazardous waste. And then last but not least, we have toxicity characteristic waste. EPA has that nice table, those 40 contaminants, one test, the T-clip. You're equal to or above that threshold, it is a toxicity characteristic waste. You're below that, EPA doesn't regulate it as a toxicity characteristic waste. Now in California, we have 2 tables. We have one table that includes inorganic constituents. We have another table that includes organic constituents. Some of these also appear on EPA's table. Some of them don't. So some of the constituents, inorganic or organic, that are regulated in California aren't regulated by EPA, and vice versa. Some of those that are on EPA's list, they may not be on either of these tables, but they may be included in that list of chemicals that create a presumptive hazardous waste. Now, the difference with these inorganic and organic constituents, EPA uses the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure. California uses a waste extraction test, and we look at the total threshold limit concentration or the soluble threshold limit concentration. In the STLC, soluble threshold limit concentration, is similar to the T-clip, where the whole intent is what happens if we take that waste, we put it in a landfill, it's exposed to the environment, what of those constituents is a concentration that will leach out? So we have definitive measures for these inorganic constituents that appear in Table 2 and Table 3. But California does not stop there, because California says if you have a waste that has an oral LD50 of less than 2,500 milligrams per kilogram, a oral LD50 less than 4,300 milligrams per kilogram, an inhalation LC50 of less than 10,000 parts per million, that is a hazardous waste. Now, the TTLC, STLC, T-clip, that's something we could do. We are not going to do a LD50 because that's where you have rabbits, mice, rats, and they're exposed to these chemicals in the concentration that half of those test animals die. That is considered the LD50 or LC50, lethal dose or lethal concentration respectively. But where can we obtain this information? Safety data sheet. So we may have this information provided on the safety data sheet. Now, the aquatic 96-hour LC50, that is a big one in California, because California says if your waste kills fish, and we use certain types of fish, that waste is considered to be a hazardous waste. So it could be one of those inorganic, organic listed constituents. We have specific thresholds. Could be based on oral, dermal, inhalation, LDR, LC50, or if it kills fish, or if it contains any of these listed carcinogens equal to or greater than 0.001%, if it contains any of these listed carcinogens. And what happens in a lot of cases, because of our presumptive waste, is that some generators may have a waste that's presumed to be a hazardous waste. It may be more cost effective to defer, call it a hazardous waste, manage it as such, as opposed to actually sample it, test it, to determine if it's a non-hazardous waste. Because we may have some discrepancies, fluctuations with the waste when it's generated that will affect further waste that is generated, so we may have to have additional analytical, which may be more costly than just saying, hey, it's a hazardous waste and disposing of it as such. So that's RCRA, non-RCRA hazardous waste. Any questions? Man, I'm good. Not one single question? Yes, sir.
The M list of mercury.
Yes.
What does that fit in?
Those are those mercury-containing products aren't managed as universal waste. And I personally have never seen anyone apply an M code to a mercury waste. Could be a RCRA hazardous waste, which means it's regulated in California, but I typically see those managed as a universal waste. Yep.
The M list is still.
Yep, we still have it there, so that's for those mercury-containing wastes that are not managed as universal waste. Yep. All right. Now, all hazardous wastes in California will have one California state waste code applied to that waste stream. RCRA hazardous waste may have multiple waste codes because it could be listed and exhibit a characteristic. It may exhibit more than one characteristic. But our California state waste codes, we could only apply one state waste codes. Now, our state waste codes are also 3-digit waste codes. The difference with our state waste codes, how we could differentiate, determine, when we talk about shipping requirements, we look at the manifest. If you look in box 13 of the manifest, this is where our waste codes will appear. You see a 3-digit waste code preceded by a letter, FKPUD. Oh, it's a RCRA hazardous waste. You see a 3-digit waste code that is not preceded by a letter, 221, 223, 352, 181. Oh, it's a non-RCRA hazardous waste. Now, the state code is important because this is a code that is used by DTSC when we talk about the shipping requirements, we have to provide them copies of our manifest. They track us by our EPA ID number. They track the volume of hazardous waste we generate by these waste codes, and then they also track how that waste is managed by the Hazardous Waste Management Report Code. So the waste codes that we apply to our waste stream, they're important because that may drive options for transportations and options for disposal. So those are the waste codes. And when we talk about the manifest, we'll show you where those appear on the manifest. Now we do have some exemptions, exclusions for certain wastes. In these wastes, not that they're not a hazardous waste, but if we manage these wastes accordingly, they're not subject to hazardous waste regulations. So these exemptions or exclusions don't say, hey, this waste isn't a hazardous waste, throw it in the trash. It says if we manage it, follow the associated regulation or statute, then it's not subject to hazardous waste regulations. That's to our benefit. One, the volumes of these wastes that we generate don't affect our generator status. Two, we could store these wastes on site longer than we could store our hazardous waste on site in some instances. And three, when these wastes are shipped off site to be recycled or disposed of, we do not have to use a registered hazardous waste transporter nor a manifest associated with the transportation of this waste. And these wastes include empty containers. Now, we will talk about how we define an empty container. We'll talk about the associated management standards and what excludes an empty container from being managed as hazardous waste. But empty containers, we could exempt those from hazardous waste management standards if we manage those accordingly. Also applies to spent lead acid batteries. But this applies to batteries that are similar in size and shape to automotive batteries. So we'll talk about how we manage those spent lead acid automotive batteries. This also includes universal waste, which could be all other types of batteries, which could be spent lamps, fluorescent lamps, sodium vapor lamps. It could be mercury-containing devices or products. It could be CRT tubes, CRT glass. It could be electronic devices or aerosol cans. So those wastes, hazardous waste, because they may exhibit a characteristic of a hazardous waste, but we can manage those as universal waste. Also, for drain-used oil filters, we could recycle those. Used oil is a hazardous waste. We have to manage it as such. It affects our generator status. We put it in a tank. We're a large quantity generator. That tank has to have a tank assessment done. But our drain-used oil filters, we send those off-site for their scrap metal value. We are not required to manage those as hazardous waste. And then lastly, latex paint. And there is a booth, they're probably gone by now, for paintcare.org. So we have options as a business that generates latex paint, which is a presumptive hazardous waste in California, but if it is recycled, not subject to hazardous waste regulations. Doesn't affect our generator status. And Paint Care will take it for free. How cool is that? So we'll talk about how we identify these wastes, how we manage these to get these out of the hazardous waste regulations. So we covered some specific regulatory requirements that may affect our facility depending on our generator status, whether we're large, small quantity generators, obtaining EPA ID numbers, doing the annual verification. We looked at what isn't a hazardous waste, difference between federally, RCRA, and state non-RCRA hazardous waste. Looked at some of those exemptions, exclusions, some of those wastes, empty containers, lead acid automotive batteries, universal waste, drain-used oil filters, and latex paint. Now we're going to talk about the container and tank management standards for hazardous waste. And these management standards apply whether it is a RCRA or a non-RCRA hazardous waste. So if we generate a waste, we determine that waste is a hazardous waste. These are the associated standards for our facility when we put that waste in a container or tank. So first we want to look at how we define containers and tanks. So in California, we could put hazardous waste in a container or tank. So how containers are defined, any device, open or close, and you can see we put emphasis, portable, in which material can be stored, handled, treated, transported, recycled, or disposed of. So that definition comes from Title 22. So earlier someone said, hey, I have a portable tank. Is that a tank? Now, if that tank is portable, I wouldn't call that a tank. I would call it a container. Because what is not included in this definition, size, shape, volume, or material of construction, right? It's a device, open or close, portable, key word, in which we could put material, transport, treat, recycle, dispose of material. And here are some examples of different devices that would be considered containers. So we have a 40-yard bin. That is a portable device. We put hazardous waste in that bin. That is subject to the same management standards as if we used a 55-gallon drum. We have a 330-gallon tote. It's on a skid. That's not a tank, not a portable tank. For us, we would call that a container. So this is how we define a container. Now, a tank is defined, again, we place emphasis, a stationary device designed to contain accumulation of hazardous waste constructed primarily of non-earthen materials which provide structural support. What isn't included in this definition, again, size, shape, volume, anything like that. And one thing that you want to consider or be aware of, if you have a trench, you put hazardous waste in there, an inspector shows up, they find hazardous waste in that trench. That trench, since it's stationary, guess how they may consider that trench or subject what regulations they may subject that trench to. That is a tank. So you want to avoid that. Tank, stationary. Container, those are portable devices. And again, we have some examples of things that would be considered tanks. They're bolted down, they're hard pipe, they're plumb. These are stationary devices, not portable. These would be considered tanks. So we generate a hazardous waste. We put in a container, we put in a tank. We'll talk about how we label those, and we'll talk about the inspection requirements associated with those, and we'll talk about the accumulation time limits. Now, generators. We want to have a designated area, accumulation area, typically referred to as central accumulation area, in which we accumulate, store our hazardous waste. Now, we may have a large location, buildings, multiple buildings, single site, where we generate or store, accumulate hazardous waste. So we could have more than one of these locations, but we want to ensure each of these areas in which we accumulate, store hazardous waste meets the same standards. Now, one thing that we have to adhere to for these accumulation areas is that we are limited to the time, and in some cases, the amount of hazardous waste that could be stored in these respective areas. And that is determined based on our generator status. So if we are a large quantity generator, hazardous waste, whether it's in a container or tank, we could only store it on site for 90 days from the date waste is first placed in that container or tank. However, there is no limit for how much hazardous waste could be stored on site. So large quantity generators, you put hazardous waste in a tank container, you have 90 days before that waste has to be transported off-site to be recycled or disposed of. Small quantity generators, you have 180 days. However, you are afforded an additional 90 days if your hazardous waste is shipped further than 200 miles from your facility to be recycled or disposed of. So small quantity, you have 180, potentially 270 days, but you are limited to 6,000 kilograms that you could store on site. Now, conditionally exempt, you have no time limit. However, once you hit 220 pounds of hazardous waste, that's when your clock starts. So while you're accumulating hazardous waste up to 220 pounds, there is no specified duration for how long that waste could stay on site. But once you hit 220 pounds, then you have 180 days before you have to ship it off for disposal or recycle, and you cannot store more than 1,000 kilograms of hazardous waste on site. And remember, it was only a couple hours ago, doesn't it seem like about 6 or 7 hours ago when we talk about most common violations? Almost seems like yesterday, right? One of the common violations is, hey, we generate hazardous waste, we put it in a container, we put it in a tank, we keep it on site for too long. We're large quantity, it's been on site for 100 days. We're small quantity, it's been on site for 200 days. So you want to make sure that once it's generated, it's shipped off site in accordance with these requirements. Now, some management standards for our facility: large quantity generators for ignitable and reactive waste, your accumulation areas, they have to be at least 50 feet from property line. So if you're a large quantity generator, you store, accumulate ignitable D001, reactive D003 hazardous waste has to be stored at least 50 feet from your property line. Now, this next bullet, this is one of those things, I can't tell you what it is. An inspector may not be able to tell you what it is. This is just one of those things that they know what it isn't when they see it. Your facility must be maintained to minimize spill, leak, fire, explosion involving hazardous waste. What does that mean? I don't know. But if I show up somewhere and I see a drum tipped over, that's probably not this. I see containers that are open, that may not be this. So our facility, we must maintain it to minimize the spill, release, fire, explosion involving hazardous waste. Now, we also have some fire code requirements: continuous slab with berms, away from drains or catch basins. So these are some facility standards for our facility. Large quantity generator, 50 feet from property line. We want to make sure all of us, large and small quantity generators, minimize any potential for a spill release at our facility. Now, hazardous waste also must be secure, and the regulations say we must secure that hazardous waste so the public does not have access to it, and livestock do not have access to that hazardous waste. Now, if we cannot secure the hazardous waste, so public and/or livestock does not have access to it, then we have to have some security measures in place, video surveillance, or we could post signs: danger, hazardous waste accumulation area, unauthorized personnel keep out. These signs must be visible from 25 feet away. They must be posted so we could see them. The public, and I guess livestock as well, could see them as they approach those hazardous waste storage areas. So we have to secure our hazardous waste so the public and livestock do not have access. And additionally, if we have employees, we're large or small quantity generator, we have employees that access these areas, add waste to containers in these areas, locate or relocate containers within these areas. Guess what those employees must have? Training. Absolutely. We want to ensure that those employees are trained. Now, here's an example. We have a fence. We have signage posts. Doesn't have to be a fence, but that would absolutely be a best management practice. Now, we are required to have emergency equipment on site. Now, small quantity generators, we must test and maintain our emergency equipment. Large quantity generators must have an inspection schedule and records available. So we want to have internal communication devices, fire extinguishers, spill control equipment. Small quantity generators, we test it, and then large quantity generators, we have an inspection schedule. So this is an emergency equipment that we have to have available on site at our facility. Now, this is the #1 violation: finding when facilities are inspected. Mislabeled, unlabeled, incorrectly labeled containers of hazardous waste. So you want to ensure that any container that has hazardous waste, whether it's a RCRA hazardous waste, whether it is a non-RCRA hazardous waste, that as soon as you put waste in that container, you have this information at a minimum displayed on that container. That information is legible, and as you approach that container, this information is visible. So what is required for storage, this isn't the same information that is required when we ship that container offsite, but for storage, you must have the words hazardous waste. You must include the generator's name and address. The generator's not the employee, not the department that generated that hazardous waste, but it's a business. You have to identify the contents, what waste is in that container. Don't put RCRA, non-RCRA. Put oil, oily debris, corrosive waste, aqueous waste containing metals. We want to identify what that waste is. We do have to identify if that waste is a solid or a liquid. We also have to identify the hazardous property or properties associated with that waste. Now, any standard hazardous waste label that you get, you see, you use, will give you 5 options for hazardous properties. It's flammable, it's corrosive, it's reactive, it's toxic or other. Don't mark other. It's not a hazardous waste because it's other, right? We only have 4 categories of characteristic waste. So you want to mark one, at least one, maybe more. And then one of the most important things that we have to have on that container, on that label, because we have to track, make sure we get our waste off within 90 or 180 days, is we have to have the accumulation start date. Yes, sir? Do they change? No. That you couldn't get now I think you're asking a different question. There is nothing in regulations regarding dimensions or size of labels that are required. So if you have a smaller container and you have a 6x6 label that doesn't fit on that container, the regulations don't say the label has to be 6x6. Just information. Thank you. Thank you. So we will talk about satellite accumulation. Labeling requirements are one and the same, but we will have to have a second date in certain instances. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between accumulated start date and generated start date on some of the labels?
Nothing. That's the date you first place waste in that container.
And it's not, it has both of them on there. So what?
Okay, that may be. That sounds like a satellite accumulation label, because for satellite containers, we would have to put 2 dates on it. So we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. So this information must be displayed on any container that has hazardous waste. Regulations don't require demand specific dimension, size, colors, font, anything like that. So we have to have this information. Legible, invisible. Now, again, number 1 violation. And when we talk about these violations, if an inspector shows up, you have 10 containers that hold hazardous waste. All 10 of those containers are improperly labeled. That's not one violation for improperly labeled containers. That is essentially 10 separate violations. So these violations could add up and multiply, so you want to be aware of that. So make sure you have this information. Now, containers that we put our hazardous waste in. This is pretty straightforward. They have to be closed except when we're adding or removing waste. So we have a container we put hazardous waste in, it has to be closed. Now the intent is that these containers, except as we are actively adding or removing waste from those containers, are securely closed so that if they are knocked over, the contents would not be dispersed. Now, this could be somewhat subjective. EPA actually put out a interpretation document regarding container closure, which it seems pretty straightforward, right? I could probably sum that up in a couple sentences. It was 22 pages long. So it may not be as straightforward as we think it is. But the beta test is, hey, if that container gets knocked over, is the lid gonna come off? Are the contents gonna be released to the environment? And if the answer is yes, that container is not closed. So you wanna make sure the container is closed, the container is in good condition, that there are no signs of leaking, damage, rusting, anything like that, and the container is compatible with the waste. So the regulations do not require us to use any specific type of containers unless it has VOCs greater than 500 parts per million. Then we have to use a DOT authorized UN container. But other than that, has to be kept closed, has to be in good condition, has to be compatible with the waste. So for our containers, we meet that, we have it labeled, we're good. Now, for our areas where we store our containers, which could be a drum, could be a tote, could be a bucket, we have to have adequate aisle space to allow the unimpeded access, responders, spill control equipment, decon equipment, etc. It is not specified in regulation that aisle space has to be 24 inches, 36 inches, 48 inches, just that we have adequate aisle space. So if there is an issue with one of the containers, we could access it, we could remove it, we could contain it, we could clean it up, whatever the case is. So if you see this picture down here on the right, for storage, that would absolutely not be acceptable. Not only do we not have adequate aisle space, if an inspector showed up and looked at that storage area, guess what they cannot see on any of those containers? The labels. The labels. So we want to make sure we have adequate aisle space. Now, how I have seen this typically applied in container accumulation areas, whatever the largest container is, whether it's a 55-gallon drum or a tote, inspectors expect that the aisle space is at least as wide enough to navigate one of those containers up and down the aisle space. So we want to make sure we have adequate aisle space. Thank you. Question? Yes, sir.
If I generate a small amount of hazardous waste and I have multiple containers of small in size, can I put multiple containers in a, let's say, Ziploc bag and then tag it with a label?
Multiple containers in a Ziploc, but what do you mean?
Well, let's say I order a lot of chemicals that are 100 grams in size.
Oh, okay, okay.
I don't want to put a label on each and every one.
Uh-huh.
If they're all the same type of
Uh-huh.
chemical, can I put, let's say, 10 of those bottles in a Ziploc bag and then tag that Ziploc bag with that label?
I don't think a Ziploc bag would be considered or could be considered a container because you cannot use that Ziploc bag to ship out those containers. So I would say that does not meet the definition of a container. But what you can do, you don't have to use a 5-gallon bucket or a 30-gallon drum or a 55-gallon drum. They have 1-gallon pails. You could put those chemicals that are all compatible in that 1-gallon bucket. You don't have to label everything in that bucket. You only need one label on the outside of that bucket. I would not consider a Ziploc bag to meet the definition of a container because you can use that for transportation. So by that fact alone, it would not be considered a container. Now, incompatible hazardous waste cannot be mixed or placed in the same container together, nor can we reuse a container that has residue that could react with any hazardous waste that we place in that container. So you want to make sure that you do not mix any potentially incompatible hazardous waste together in the same container. Now, again, you folks will have access to this reference document. In this reference document, we have a list of potentially incompatible hazardous waste. And this waste is broken up into two groups. Group A, those are on the left-hand side of the screen there. Those waste are incompatible with any waste in Group B, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. So we want to look, oh, hey, this is Group A, this is Group B. We can put them together, and it tells us if we mix these wastes together, what the potential consequences could be. Generation of heat, potential fire or explosion. So this is a guidance document for us to use when we determine, hey, I'm going to put all these in the same bucket container. Is there a potential that they'll react? If there is, we can't do it. If there isn't, we could commingle those, mix those, place those in the same container. Your parking's going to cost you $30 for today, so do not do that. Question? Did you just wake up? I said, as this class gets concluded, I'm going to give you a link where you could download the manual. So you know what that means? You have to stick around until 4:45 or later if you want to have access to the manual. So, what? Huh? You're awake? All right, cool, thank you. I'm awake too. And we have audio now. We have audio. All right, so that's container management. Now, when we look at container management, it's pretty straightforward, right? Label it. Close it. Make sure it's in good condition. Make sure that that container is compatible with the waste. Pretty straightforward. Our facility, we want to make sure we minimize any potential for spill, release, fire, explosion, have adequate aisle space. Pretty straightforward. Now for tanks. Tanks, the labeling is a little different, which makes sense. A tank is stationary. It's not portable, so for tanks, the only thing that we need on tanks are the words hazardous waste, and we have to have the accumulation start date. So we don't need generators information, we don't need hazardous properties, contents, composition, we don't need any of that, just the words hazardous waste, accumulation start date. Now it is recommended when that tank is picked up, emptied, pumped out by your contractor, that you mark that tank as being empty. Because at that point, since it's empty, and there's guidance from DTSC because the tank's never truly going to be empty, right? When it's empty to practical extent, at that point, it's kind of outside regulations. We don't have to worry about inspecting it. We do not have to worry about that affecting our generator status or that 90 or 180-day rule. So mark it hazardous waste, accumulation start date, you pump it out, you empty it, you put that date on it. Now, large quantity generators for their tanks, this is for hazardous waste, must have secondary containment. So if you're a large quantity generator, you put hazardous waste in a tank, regardless of the volume, you must have secondary containment. In addition to that secondary containment, you have to have that tank assessment done once every 5 years, certified by a PE. Now, you know what doesn't require secondary containment? Containers. However, if we use secondary containment, that may be a best management practice, but under Title 22 of 40 CFR, we do not need secondary containment.
But those tanks are portable, isn't it?
No, those are tanks. They're stationary. That's bolted. No, they're stationary. Those are tanks. Now, this label, this is an alternative we have for tanks and containers that are in continuous use. And these are tanks or containers, which could be a drum. We put waste in them. Those containers, or that tank doesn't leave our facility, our contractor comes, they pump out those tanks or containers rather than putting a new label on or identifying them as empty every time they're emptied out. What is cool about this label, we have a start date. We put waste in that container, we put the start date on there. How long do we have as a large quantity generator? Small, 180 days. That container tank has to be pumped out. So our contractor, they show up, they pump it out, they put the pickup date. That is the date it's empty. Now, we don't have 90 or 180 days it's empty. We don't have to potentially inspect that container or tank. So it's empty. Once we start adding waste, we put a new start date. Now our clock starts. So rather than taking off a label, putting a new label, changing the accumulation start date, every time your tank or your container is pumped out, this label is something that we could use as an alternative. What? Yes. You have a tank? Yeah. Okay. One more time. Your tank's full. What do you have to do? You have to call your contractor and get it pumped out. What's that? Yes. Okay. Yes. What to do? Get a second portable container. Call your contractor, and I appreciate you call your contractor and you say, hey, my tank and my container's full. They're kind of like the cable guy. Hey, I'll be there next Wednesday between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., right? I'm not going to inspect your facility. No, just because the container or tank is full, you're not breaking any law. You would only be breaking the law if it was on site for more than 90 or 180 days. Oh, you don't need containment on the portable tank. If it's correct. Absolutely, absolutely. Containers do not need secondary containment for haz waste. However, you may be subject to other statutes, APSA, SPCC, where you would have to have secondary containment. But if it is a portable container, haz waste regulations do not require you to have secondary containment. Does have to be closed. You have to have spill equipment. You have to have procedures in place. If it is knocked over, how to contain it, clean it up. Yep. And you can't keep it on site for more than 90 or 180 days. What's that? Okay. Man, when you leave, do not stop and pick up your certificate. Orange County may be eyeing you, man. I would just run out. I'm kidding. All right, one more labeling requirement. This is for used oil. Doesn't matter. Container, portable container, tank. If it has used oil in it, we have to meet the container and tank labeling requirements, but also we have to display the words used oil on that container, portable container, and or tank. So when we use a tank, hazardous waste accumulation start date, we put used oil in it, we also have to mark it with the words used oil. We have a container, we have to have the words hazardous waste, generator's name, address, contents, physical state, hazardous property accumulation start date, and the words used oil. Now, they sell these labels that say used oil. Again, regulations do not require any specific use of label, size, dimension, shape, color. So if you have a label and it says contents or composition, in place of purchasing one of these labels, you know what I would put on that line? Used oil. Used oil, so it is marked appropriately. All right, housekeeping. So when we are visited by the CUPA, not me, but the CUPA, and when they show up at your facility, they're looking at two things. One, they want to see your records, documentation. They want to see that you have those manifests, personnel training records, that you have your contingency plan tank assessment if you're subject to those requirements. They want to see your inspection records. And they also look at our facility, where we generate, where we store our hazardous waste, and they are judging us on housekeeping. So housekeeping could help keep us in compliance. And again, housekeeping is cleaning up spills, closing containers, making sure containers are labeled. And these are potential issues, if an inspector discovered, could be potential compliance issues. And if an inspector finds this, or anything that is outside of compliance, there are 3 different levels of fines, penalties, or violations. The first level is called a minor violation. A minor violation is something that, if you don't do it, doesn't put the public, the environment, employees at risk. This would be an example of a minor violation. Hey, we put a label on there, label's peeling off. Maybe it's faded, we can't read it. Minor violation. A minor violation will result in a notice to comply. That's a fix-it ticket. Inspector finds this, they say, hey, that container I observed, the label was peeling off, correct it, send me a picture, show me that you corrected it. Now here's another issue. We have labels are not legible, they've been outside, they're faded. Still a minor violation. However, if we are a recalcitrant offender, a repeat offender, they showed up last year, they find labeling issues. They show up this year, they found labeling issues. It could go from a minor violation, fix a ticket, to a Class 2 violation. Now the difference, a Class 2 violation could result in an administrative enforcement order. They could fine you. You fix it, and you have to pay a penalty. So we want to stay out of, potentially stay away from any of these Class 2 violations, because these could result in fines. And those could result from repeat offenses. Now here's an example. We have a container, we put a lid on it. There is no way this would be considered a closed container though, right? Doesn't matter what's in it, that container gets knocked over. Whatever in it is going to be released to the environment. So when an inspector sees this, this is an open container. Now, if we use funnels, the one thing that we want to ensure with our funnels, that funnels can demonstrate closure. So if we look at this, that's good. We have that screwed into the drum. We have a valve on there so we could close it. If that container's knocked over, nothing is going to be released. Inspector sees this. We have the funnel. The bung cap's out. What's going to happen if that container gets knocked over? Everything's going to be released. That's good. That's bad. That's in compliance. That is a potential violation, so we want to avoid that. Now, container condition. If an inspector's seen this, we may have gotten more waste on the container than in the container, right? That's not good. This is a clear housekeeping issue. Now, not saying that this would be indicative, but above a Class 2 violation is a Class 1 violation. Class 1 violations, those are violations that put the public, environment, employees' health at risk. And by not complying with regulations, that allows the company to derive some sort of financial benefit. So if we are hit with a Class 1 violation, that's at the top of the heap. Hey, you really put the public, the environment, health at risk, and you didn't comply, so you derive some sort of financial benefit or gain. Class 1 violation. So this, good news though, look, that label's legible. And if I was an inspector, you know what I would say? Obviously, you put waste in this container before you put the label on it. How do you have waste underneath that label and that label is clear? So now this could be a big one. This potentially could be possibly considered a Class 1 violation. So this is a dumpster, and inspectors, especially how your facility appears, may look in the trash. If things are neat, orderly, their assumption is, man, you know what, this facility has it together. If they saw what we saw on the last slide, without exception, they're going to look in the trash. And if they look in the trash and they find something that shouldn't be in the trash, we potentially could be cited for two things. So this is a reg saturated with oil. Used oil is a hazardous waste. This may or may not be a hazardous waste. It depends, but we would have to verify it isn't. Now this reg also has metal fines on it. Scrap metal isn't a hazardous waste. But fine powder, metal fines less than 100 microns in size, that can't be managed as scrap metal. That may be a hazardous waste. So if we haven't tested, determined if it is or isn't a hazardous waste, we throw this in the trash, one of our employees throw this in the trash, we could be cited for one of two things. One, we failed to determine if it is or isn't a hazardous waste. Or worst case scenario, this could be considered potentially illegal disposal of hazardous waste, because you know what we cannot do with any hazardous waste? Put it in the trash. Put it in the trash. So this is something that we would want to avoid. So this potentially might be something that could be considered a Class 1 violation. Now this, I told you, facility maintained to minimize the spill release. I couldn't tell you what it was until I saw it. Wow, you've had spills. You didn't minimize any potential for releases. Not only that, check this out. That's a stormwater drain. That is a huge issue right there. So this would absolutely be an issue. And here's an example. We have containers outside. No, this isn't waste, I'm using it. Oh, you are. I don't see labels. I see rusted containers. I see these aerosol cans. You can't tell me that these aerosol cans are in use. So an inspector may make is, hey, this isn't material that you're using, that you have an intended purpose for. This is discarded, which makes it a waste. And again, we didn't determine if it's a hazardous waste. It's not labeled. We're not complying with container management standards. Some of these containers are open. So that could be another huge issue. Full disclosure regarding these pictures. These pictures were not taken at any one of your facilities. Though they may look like some of your facilities, these pictures were not obtained from any one of you folks in attendance today. So just let me clarify that. All right. Now, container inspections. And this is for small and large quantity generators. Hazardous waste containers must be inspected weekly. Regulations do not require that those inspections are documented. But again, to verify or prove that we did those inspections, we want to make sure we document those inspections. So you want to inspect those containers. And when we inspect them, what we're looking for, bless you, it's labeled. We have an accumulation start date. It hasn't been on site for more than 90 or 180 days. It's closed. It's in good condition. There's no spills or releases, anything like that. So that's what we're looking for. Now, whoever is responsible for container inspections at your facility, you want to make sure they actually are doing the container inspections. I cannot tell you how many facilities I have gone to, and inspections are completed. That's a good thing. But who's ever completing the inspections is not reading the inspection form. Because I'll look at it, container securely closed. They mark yes. Oh, okay, nice. Containers, any signs of, have containers been on site less than 90? Yes, okay, good, they're me. And then as you get down the list, after who's ever doing the inspections, they figure out that, or they think the correct answer is yes, they just start marking yes. You get down to the, any signs of spills? Yes. Okay, well that's not good. Now we have 3 years worth of records that say every week when we do these inspections, we find spills. So do not just paper whip these inspections. Pencil whip these inspections. Make sure they're done. Make sure you have records. If there is anything that you discover out of compliance, make sure it's corrected. Now, tanks. Tank inspections are a little different. Small quantity generators must look at discharge controls, monitoring data, tank level daily. Tanks, for small quantity generators, must be inspected weekly. Large quantity generators, tanks, and these items must be inspected each operating day, and the inspections must be recorded, documented, signed by the person that did them, and retained on site for 3 years. So large quantity generators, you have to do it each operating day, have to retain those records for 3 years. Now, operating day is considered each day you're open, normal business, and there's waste in that tank. So if your facility is open Monday through Friday, you do not have to perform tank inspections on Saturday and Sunday. Yes, ma'am. For tanks? For the containers? For the containers, absolutely. You could do the weekly observations, inspections, document it monthly, that's no problem. If you're a large quantity generator for tanks, you have to do the tank inspections each operating day, and you have to have an inspection for each day. For small, absolutely, absolutely. Yep. Except, again, these items must be inspected daily for small quantity generators. In here, this form, this is available at the Unidocs website, so this is a inspection form that we could use as well. Containers, tanks, etc. This is a record documentation that we could use to ensure we've done those inspections. That's our container accumulation. Now we had any questions before we move on to satellite? Yes, sir.
What should be done to the original containers of PDs you have in place if you pretty much empty out the original container? Do you have to do anything?
One more time.
The original containers of hazardous waste, if I used up the chemicals in those containers, what should I do about the original containers?
PRU listed? Unless it's triple rinse, it carries that PRU code. Yep. Managed as a listed hazardous waste. Unless it's triple rinsed.
Another question. If I have a chemistry lab on site, am I allowed to neutralize corrosive?
Yes. Yes.
I can neutralize that and make it non-hazardous?
Yes. There are some exemptions. Benchtop treatment, spelled out within the health and safety code. But to do that, you can't do it more than 5 gallons at any one time. The waste, when you neutralize it, it's all from the same process. It is a recognized treatment standard. Neutralization is. You have to keep logs, and employees who do that have to be trained. So you can neutralize it, make it non-hazardous, discharge it to the POTW. You have to log it. It has to all be done within the same process. It's limited to 5 gallons at a time. Employees must be trained. But yeah, you absolutely can do it. You absolutely can. Any other questions? More specific than that. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, PRU listed containers that are empty, how do you manage those? Unless they're triple rinsed, they carry those P codes. And this gentleman operates a lab, chemistry lab. He asked if it was allowed to neutralize acidic waste, discharge it as non-hazardous waste. And there are some exemptions within the health and safety code for benchtop treatment, which you can. Has to be from the same process, 5 gallons, recognized treatment standard, neutralization, you track it, you train employees, you could do that. Yes, sorry, I apologize. Yes, sir. Aerosol paint cans, can we process those, manage the contents, dispose of the aerosol can? Absolutely, you can do that. However, if you do that, When you puncture them, the contents are not universal waste. Now you have to determine RCRA, non-RCRA hazardous waste. The empty aerosol can, no longer universal waste, it's trash, or you can recycle it. You have to have a processing piece of equipment, depressurizer. You have to notify your CUPA in writing, send it certified mail, hand deliver it prior to processing those aerosol cans. You have to train employees, and you have to have a spill kit in the area that you process those aerosol cans. You do all that, you can process aerosol cans all day. You process more than 500 in any day, you may need an air permit. Less than 500, no air permit required. Diesel exhaust fluid, yeah, urea. Yes. Uh-huh. Does that need containment? No. Is containment a best management practice? Yes. Yeah. So urea in a tote doesn't need secondary containment. That tote is portable, it's a container. So whether it's new product waste, you don't need any secondary containment. Question all the way in the back. A tank where you have an inlet you're going to add, I would say that funnel, just like in a container, okay, tank, if we put a funnel in it, we're adding waste in the funnel. Does that have to be closed or open? If you're not adding waste, you'd have to close it, just like a funnel in a container. Just like a funnel in a container. So tanks, they have to be closed unless we're adding or removing waste. So if we have a inlet valve, a funnel, we leave it open. Can't do that unless we're adding waste. Any other questions before we move on to satellite? Satellite containers. Yes, sir.
When those pop and drop on the aerosol, Just Right sells a system you can buy, and by the way, that includes a carbon filter for the emissions.
Yes, so they have units for the aerosol depressuring devices. They have units that put on that go over a drum or screw into the bunghole on a closed-top drum. They do have vents, that they have filters. Now, the one benefit, you're reducing the amount of universal waste aerosol cans, but what is not a benefit is you're generating hazardous waste, the contents, and then that filter potentially is a hazardous waste as well. And those filters have to be changed out depending on the unit. It may be every 100 aerosol cans, 500 aerosol cans, whatever the case is. Was there another question over? No, okay. Are you guys coming back? I guess that's a no. Okay. All right, satellite accumulation. So container accumulation, central accumulation areas, we talked about that, discussed that. There is one other option, and these requirements are the same regardless if we are a small or large quantity generator, and this is for satellite accumulation of hazardous waste. Now, satellite accumulation occurs at or near the point where the waste is generated. So if we have a container at or near where the waste is generated, that container is under the control of the operator at all times. We could manage that container for hazardous waste as a satellite accumulation container, satellite accumulation area. Now, we have some benefits because this increases the amount of time that we could store that container on site, and we're not required to inspect that container. Now, for satellite areas, though, we are limited 55 gallons per waste stream. So we can't have more than 55 gallons per waste stream in satellite areas. And for our satellite containers, we could store these containers on site for up to a year. However, that is the total duration or amount of time that a satellite container could be stored on site. So we have 365 days in which we could accumulate waste, has to be in a container, not a tank, not more than 55 gallons, at the point at or near where it's generated. We could store it there for a year. Now, for our satellite container, Once that container becomes full, we have 3 days. It has to be moved from that satellite area to our central accumulation area. So once we reach that 55-gallon threshold or our container becomes full, we have to move it within 3 days. Now, container management standards for the satellite areas are one and the same for our central accumulation area. Closed, except if we're adding or removing waste. Compatible with the waste, in good condition. Labeled, label has to be legible and visible, and the information that we display on a satellite container is exactly the same as the information that we display in our central accumulation area. Generator's name, address, contents, physical state, properties, accumulation start date. The difference with our satellite containers, we actually may have 2 dates on those containers. Who mentioned accumulation and start date? So for a satellite container, cannot be at our facility for more than a year. So we put a start date on there. That date gives us a year. Once that container becomes full, we put the date the container became full. That gives us 3 days to move it to our central area and potentially up to an additional 90 or 180 days to store it in the central accumulation area, as long as it doesn't exceed a year on site. So if we're a large quantity generator, I have a satellite container, put my accumulation start date. I start filling that container January 1. I fill it up, it reaches capacity December 1st of that same year. By December 4th, I have to put it into my central accumulation area. But since I've already had that on site for 11 plus months, I'm only allowed to keep it on site till the end of December. I don't have an additional 90 or 180 days. Does that make sense? So it's a year total on site. A lot of people assume, hey, I move it from my satellite area, even if it's after a year or within a year, then regardless I have an additional 90 or 180 days. That is absolutely not the case. And what you want to ensure is those containers, when they're relocated to your central accumulation area, show 2 dates. Because if an inspector shows up, you have a container that has a date, it's older than 90 days or 180 days. Depending on your generator status, they're going to say, hey, this has been on site for too long. No, it hasn't. That's the start date from when it was in the satellite area. Okay, well then you have to have that second date that shows the date that container became full. And that starts your 90 or 180 day clock, not to exceed 365 days. Now here's an example of a label. We don't have to use this label, but this label helps us because it designates that container as a satellite container, and we have start date, fill date. So this displays the start date, fill date for those containers. So that's for our satellite areas. Under the control of the operator. Now these employees working in satellite areas, adding waste to that container, relocating these containers, guess what they would need? Training, hazardous waste training, absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Correct. But, okay.
So if you stop the process, and you want to restart it the next day, and you unplug it and store it, for example, do you put the date of once you unplug it or the date when you finish the process?
If you have a unit, process unit, and from that unit you may generate hazardous waste, if that unit is emptied every 90 or 180 days, the hazardous waste is removed. That is a process unit, piece of equipment. It is not a hazardous waste management unit. The issue becomes if you have a unit, a process, you accumulate hazardous waste in it, you leave that waste in it for longer than 90 or 180 days, that unit now becomes a hazardous waste unit. Otherwise, that waste is not a hazardous waste until you remove it from the unit, the equipment.
Right, but the start date, is the start date?
That piece of equipment is a process unit you don't have to label it hazardous waste, start date, anything. It's not a hazardous waste until you remove the waste from that process or unit.
But even if you unplug it and store it and then put it back, you still don't have to put the
No, it's a process, it's a unit. Just as long, the only way that that unit would become a waste unit is if you left waste in there longer than 90 or 180 days. You got ding. Well, what's your unit?
it's a small lab process waste.
You got dinged for that. Okay. I see that that's a unit. If you could show, verify, hey, are you large or small quantity? So every 179 days, we empty this out. That's when it becomes a waste. That's when we manage it as such. It doesn't, I'm not using it. I may use it every other day, whatever. It's part of the process, part of the equipment. Doesn't become a waste till you remove it from that process or equipment. If you left it in there for a year, I could see getting dinged on that. So, can't help you after the fact. All right, now we're going to talk about basic shipping requirements. Now, hazardous waste, whether it's RCRA or non-RCRA hazardous waste, has to be transported by a registered haz waste transporter. If you are a small or a large quantity generator, you cannot self-transport any hazardous waste. If you are a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, you could self-transport your hazardous waste. It has to go to a permitted household hazardous waste facility. You don't have to use a manifest. So that's exemption you get as a conditionally exempt small quantity generator. Additional duration to store your waste on site, and you don't have to use a manifest or a registered haz waste transporter. Otherwise, doesn't matter, RCRA, non-RCRA hazardous waste, we have to use a registered haz waste transporter and a manifest. Now, this is our manifest form. This is a federal form. This form is required by EPA, and EPA says any generator with any state within the U.S., when they ship out, offer their hazardous waste to be transported off-site, to be disposed of or recycled, must use this manifest system. So this is a manifest that we are required to use when we offer our haz waste for transportation. Now this manifest, we have 20 boxes that must be completed. We as a generator are responsible for the information in boxes 1 through 15, which must be completed before that waste leaves our facility. Doesn't matter if we complete it, if the contractor or transporter completes it on our behalf, if there's an error, if there's a mistake, that's our responsibility as a generator. So we want to ensure that information is correct. And if you look at box 1 on that manifest, generator's EPA ID number. So we have to have that EPA ID number. That's how we're tracked by the state. Now here, in box 9B, this is where we describe our waste, and then in box 13, this is where we include our waste codes. So when you sign off on your manifest, you look in box 13, if you see a waste code F003D001, oh, it's a RCRA hazardous waste. You see only a state code, 352, 181, 223. It is a non-RCRA hazardous waste. And again, we want to make sure that we could distinguish, because if it's a RCRA hazardous waste, if you look right here in box 9B, it says use proper DOT shipping description. And we have to adhere to the requirements, not in 40 CFR, not in Title 22, not in the Health and Safety Code, but in 49 CFR, with those shipping descriptions spelled out in the hazmat table. We have to use a shipping description provided to us within hazmat transportation regulations. And it tells us what information has to be included. Proper shipping name, hazard class, ID number, and packing group, if any. That has to be included in box 9B. Now, if our waste is not RCRA, not subject to DOT regulations, we cannot describe it in that same fashion. Title 22 says the only description that we could use, and this is important because I have seen this mistake happen more frequent than not our fault, contractor fault, The only description that we could use for waste, non-RCRA, that's not regulated by DOT, is non-RCRA hazardous waste. We have to identify whether it's a liquid or a solid, and in parentheses, we have to identify why it's hazardous. Used oil, oily debris, waste antifreeze, whatever the case is. I have seen manifests that say non-RCRA, non-regulated, non-DOT regulated. DOT doesn't care about those descriptions because they don't regulate that waste. But DTSC could ding you for that. So you want to make sure that description is correct. And the reason that we want to ensure that information is correct, because when you sign off on line 15, that is not your signature with the date saying, hey, I'm shipping out 2 barrels of used oil or a drum of oily debris. You are certifying that that information on that manifest is accurate, correct. You properly identified, packaged, marked, labeled, and placarded that shipment for transportation according to applicable regulations. So by signing that manifest, you are actually certifying you characterized it, you labeled it, you marked it, placarded it, etc. So we want to make sure we have this information correct. And if there is an error on here, DTSC, the state discovers it, they could fine us $20 per manifest. Not a huge sum, but $20. Now, if it is a DOT-regulated hazardous material, it's discovered by DOT, not likely, but it could happen. Those penalties, even for using an inappropriate description, those start at $800 and go up. So there could be greater penalties levied by DOT. Now, this manifest system, how it works. We have that copy, an original 5 carbon copies. We have it completed up to line 15. The transporter will sign off on line 17 when they accept that waste in their possession. What the transporter will then do is take that last copy, that last carbon copy of the manifest, they'll leave it with us. They'll keep the original, the 4 remaining carbon copies. They will keep that manifest with the load until it reaches a designated facility identified in box 8. Now, our responsibility as a generator is, 1, we have that last copy. DTSC says we are required to send a legible copy to them within 30 days from the date of shipment. So when your transporter leaves, you have your manifest copy, you have to submit it to DTSC, a legible copy, within 30 days from date of shipment. And here is the P.O. box that you send it to, Sacramento. Now, we also have to make sure that we get this signed manifest copy back, within 35 days. So once our waste reaches a designated facility, they receive our waste, they identify how they're going to treat our waste with codes that are placed in box 19. The designated facility will sign off on box 20, line 20 of that manifest. They will then distribute the remaining copies. They'll give one to the transporter, they'll keep one, they'll send one to us, they'll send one to the state. What we have to ensure is that we get that signed copy back from the designated facility within 35 days. If we don't, we are required to follow up on that shipment. So if you send out waste 35 days later, you have not received that signed manifest copy back, you can't do anything. You have to call the transporter, call the designated facility. Try to find out, track down where your shipment is. If it has not been resolved within 45 days or 60 days, depending on if you are a large or a small quantity generator, you are then required to submit an exception report to DTSC. And this is the address that the exception reports go to. Now, an exception report, there is not a formal template, but what we have to do, company letterhead, identify our efforts to DTSC, what we did to try to track down that shipment, provide them the manifest tracking number that is included in box 4 of that manifest, and we give them that information, and we have done our due diligence. If we receive that manifest copy back within 35 days, we're done. But what we do have to do is maintain copies on file for 3 years from date of shipment. You want to make sure you keep those for 3 years. Now, best management practice, we may want to keep those forever because our responsibility for hazardous waste doesn't end when it is on a transporter vehicle, doesn't end when it's placed in the ground. It ends until that waste no longer exists. So best management practice, maybe we retain those forever. But as far as what we have to provide to an inspector, 3 years worth of records. So we keep those for 3 years. Now in California, for certain non-RCRA hazardous waste, we can use what is called a consolidated manifest. So when we use a consolidated manifest, we're still required to use a registered haz waste transporter. The waste is still shipped on a manifest, but the difference is that transporter, when they show up, when they complete the manifest, they identify themselves both in box 5 as a generator, in box 6 as a transporter. So they pick up our waste, they put it on the manifest, they identify themselves as a generator and the transporter, and rather than get a copy of that manifest that we submit to DTSC, we get a signed copy back from the designated facility. What the transporter is required to do is leave us a receipt, and there is no standardized format for this receipt that includes the manifest tracking number, the transporter information, the facility that it's going to, our information including our EPA ID number, and the associated waste code and the volume of hazardous waste that's being shipped off-site. That manifest we keep for how long? Or that consolidated manifest receipt, how long do we keep it? 3 years. But our benefit is that we don't have the management follow-up, send it to DTSC, and usually that reduces our transportation and disposal costs. Now, small quantity generators could ship any of the approved non-RCRA hazardous waste streams on a consolidated manifest. Large quantity generators could ship oil, used oil, contents of their oil water separator on a manifest, or any of the approved non-RCRA hazardous waste streams if they would qualify as a small quantity generator if you deduct the volume of used oil in contents of the oil water separator. And these are the approved non-RCRA. We can't do it with a RCRA hazardous waste. Non-RCRA hazardous waste we could ship on a consolidated manifest. By far the most common is used oil. So when we generate used oil, transporter shows up, they pump out our containers, our tank. They don't give us a manifest, they give us a receipt, they go down the street. They commingle our used oil with other generators. Yes, sir.
I just want to clarify, you said it, I just want to make sure that I got it right. You can't use the consolidated manifest for a RCRA hazardous waste,
Correct.
no matter your status, unless you were a CESQG for RCRA.
You cannot use a consolidated manifest for a RCRA hazardous waste. Now, the Health and Safety Code does say, or if it's a RCRA hazardous waste that does not require a manifest. So maybe you could infer from that, hey, a squeegee could use but still, a transporter isn't going to pick up just conditionally exempt small quantity generators waste on a consolidated manifest, because what's the benefit as a conditionally exempt small quantity generator? We could self-transport that waste. Question? So for the manifest, where do we have to keep that manifest? Does it have to be on site? Does it have to be at a central location? Now, DOT says, hey, it has to be available at the principal place of business, and they refer to manifesting requirements. We have to be able to provide it to an inspector. So again, what I would deem is that if we have a corporate facility, we have the original stored there. We have electronic copies or Xerox copies that we have at the site that the manifest was shipped from. That is what I would consider meeting the intent of the regulation. Because if an inspector shows up and they say, hey, I want to review your manifest or your BOLs for your consolidated, oh yeah, all those are stored offsite at our corporate office. They may want to say, hey, these have to be stored here, though it is not explicit within regulations. But I would say as a best management practice, at a minimum, scanned or Xerox copies at your location that you have those available. Any other questions? Yes? Certificates of disposal. That is not something that is required, spelled out in regulation, unless it is PCB waste. You do not have to receive that. That is something that usually is generator. That's kind of something that we look for to show that our waste has been either incinerated, destructed, disposed of, and that is not a standardized template either. That is based on the facility that receives it. That is documentation that is absolutely prudent for a generator to have. So otherwise, that kind of is definitive. Hey, this waste was received at this facility, the manifest signed off, it has been destroyed or disposed of accordingly. So that is just a document that is recommended, not required by regulations, though. Any other questions? Yes?
I have a question about shipping waste out of state.
Okay. Oh, that is a great question.
There's also the requirement, and I kind of nailed it down on the generator, also mailing copies of things that TSDF does.
What do I say about that? So the question is, we have a hazardous waste, including it could be a non-RCRA hazardous waste. We ship it outside of California. Outside of California, that non-RCRA waste may be a non-hazardous waste. Nevertheless, California says we have to use a manifest to transport it. It is received at a permitted facility outside of California. Now, the manifest, the new federal manifest form has a specific page for the designated facility to send that signed copy back to the generating state. So if we send it outside of California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Arkansas, there is a designated page on that manifest system for the receiving facility to send it back to California. However, not all states require TSDFs or even generators to submit manifest copies. So if that out-of-state TSDF does not submit it back to DTSC, guess what authority DTSC has over them? None. None. DTSC has authority within California. So DTSC can't do anything. At that point, DTSC says, hey, you as a generator, you're shipping this waste, you're using an out-of-state facility. We want to make sure that we get that signed manifest copy back within 35 days of shipment. So the receiving facility should do it. They don't do it. As a generator, we should make sure a signed copy gets to DTSC within 35 days. So when we receive that signed copy back after it's reached the designated facility, if they're not going to submit it to DTSC, we should submit it to DTSC. Because they may say, hey, you use this facility, they didn't follow it, they didn't have no authority outside of California. Who knows what pressure they're going to put on us. You look, yeah, I knew you had a question.
But if it's a RCRA hazardous waste,
Yes.
the out-of-state TSDF would have to do it because it's federal.
No. Because not all state DEQ, Department of Environmental Management, requires that the designated facility or even the generator or the receiving facility sends copies of the manifest to the state agency. Yeah, so it isn't required in every state. So whether it's RCRA, non-RCRA hazardous waste, it goes outside of California. Again, DTSC has no authority of those TSDFs outside of California. Any other questions? Question. Puncturing of aerosol cans, is that considered treatment of hazardous waste? That is an activity in which you do not have to receive a permit or authorization to do so. So processing aerosol cans, is that treatment? Yes. Do you have to be authorized to do so? No. Do you have to have a permit to do so? No. Do you have to notify the CUPA that you're doing it? Yes. So you can process them. You don't need a permit. It is treatment. You don't need authorization, but you do have to notify the CUPA that you do that. What's that? Was there a question? Records for what? How long do we have to keep the manifest? 3 years. 3 years. BOL, receipt for consolidated manifest, 3 years. LDR, land disposal restriction forms, 3 years. We retain those records for 3 years. So these are our approved non-RCRA waste streams that we could ship on a consolidated manifest, by far the most common used oil, but brake fluid, antifreeze, aqueous parts cleaning solvents we could use, consolidated manifests, K through 12 schools, filters from dispensing pumps. That's everything with hazardous waste. Now we're going to look at those wastes, which are hazardous waste, but we have some exemptions within statute or regulation that says if we manage these wastes accordingly, and what's important about these exemptions is we have to follow these exemptions or exclusions from the point it's generated till it is properly recycled, then these wastes are not subject to hazardous waste management regulations, which again is to our benefit. Doesn't affect our generator status. We could store these on site for longer than 90 or 180 days. We don't have to use a manifest. We don't have to submit that manifest to DTSC, which in some cases we may have a fee when we do our EPA ID verification that we have to pay to the state. So we'll look at managing empty container spent lead acid batteries, drain used oil filters, recyclable latex paint, and universal waste. So empty containers. These regulations address containers made of non-absorptive material that previously contained a hazardous material or a hazardous waste. So if we have a container made of a non-absorptive material that previously contained a hazardous material, hazardous waste, if we empty it, it's not subject or required to be managed as hazardous waste. Now, what is important, though, is how California defines empty. California says if that container held a pourable material, we invert it. If a continuous stream comes out, container's not empty. It's not exempt from regulations. If we invert it, it drips, not a continuous stream, it's empty. Now, if that container held a non-pourable material, in any practical means, with one exception, we cannot rinse that container, but any other practical means, we scrape, we chisel, we remove the contents, it's empty, we can't rinse it, then it is not subject to regulations. Now, if that container is larger than 5 gallons, less than 119 gallons, and we send it off-site to be reclaimed for scrap metal value. We send it off-site so that container is reconditioned. It could be reused. We send it back to the manufacturer so it could be refilled. The only thing that we have to do is mark the date that container became empty. And we have to ship that container off-site to be recycled within 1 year from the date it became empty. You keep it on site for more than 1 year, guess what? It's not exempt anymore, right? So you have to make sure it is sent off site within a year from the day it became empty. Now, we do have to keep records, facility it went to, date it was shipped to the facility, number of containers. These records, they don't have to be a manifest, could be a bill of lading, doesn't have to be submitted to DTSC, but we do have to keep these records on file, provide these upon request to an inspector for 3 years from date of shipment. So if the container is empty, greater than 5 gallons, less than 55 gallons, put the date it became empty, Marking it empty, that's the best management practice, but what you want to ensure is that container is shipped off-site within a year from the date it became empty. Now, here's an example. There's no specific management standards. Doesn't have to be indoors, doesn't have to be outdoors, doesn't have to be in secondary containment. We just mark it empty, date it became empty, ensure that it's empty, keep those records, where it went to, when it went, how many empty containers were sent. Now, if the container is 5 gallons or less, and again, meets that definition of empty for pourable or non-pourable material, we do not have to recycle it. We could dispose of this in approved landfill. So we send it out as trash. That is allowed for containers that are 5 gallons or less, unless it was a PRE illicit waste. Can't do that. Unless it was triple rinse. Can't do that. So if it's 5 gallons or less in empty, we could dispose of it. Now, this picture is not a great representation, though, because what we don't want to do, well, we know we could throw it in the trash, so I'm going to open these containers to dry them, to let the contents evaporate. That could be considered treatment, because if it has to dry or evaporate, it wasn't empty. It wasn't exempt from regulations. And if an inspector showed up and said, hey, you have all these containers empty, what the heck are you doing here? Oh, well, I'm drying them because then I could throw them in the trash. They're going to say, okay, nice. And then when you get that report, they're going to say, hey, you had all these containers that you were treating potentially to dispose of in the trash. So if they're empty, we don't have to dry them, we don't have to rinse them, we don't have to wipe them out. Just ensure they meet the definition of empty, dispose of accordingly. Now, the one thing that I would recommend for you folks, containers 5 gallons or less, any container that has your company information on it, before you throw that container in the trash, remove your company information, spray over it something, because if someone dumpster dives, takes out that container from your trash can, they fill it up, they leave it on the side of the 405 freeway, guess who that waste belongs to? Your company, your company. So make sure you remove your information. Yes?
If it's empty alcohol, let's say, we had a puncture before we threw it away, not even damage them, so it could be.
5-gallon container, alcohol, empty. Gentleman was told that the container had to be punctured, pierced before it was thrown in the trash. That is not required by regulations. That is a best management practice. The only time that we have to puncture, pierce, make a container so it cannot be reused is if it was a pesticide container. If it was a pesticide container. But I see that as, that's practical. That makes sense. That makes sense. Not required by regulations, but it makes sense. It makes sense. All right, now batteries. These regulations apply to batteries that are similar in size and shape to lead-acid automotive batteries, including UPS backup batteries. Now, for these batteries, they would be hazardous, right? Because they contain sulfuric acid, pH less than 2, contain lead, could be a toxicity hazardous waste. But the intent is that these batteries aren't going to a landfill. They're not being disposed of. These batteries are reclaimed, recycled for their core value. So if we recycle our batteries, lead-acid automotive batteries, the only thing that we have to do, store them upright on a pallet on a sealed surface, protect the terminals so they do not short circuit. We could store up to a ton on site, regardless of our generator status, for a year. If we have more than a ton, we cannot store those batteries for more than 180 days. Now, when these batteries are shipped off site, not hazardous waste manifests, no waste codes applied to it, but we do have to have a receipt, bill of lading, record where they were shipped to, name and address of the receiving facility with the telephone number, date they were shipped, number of batteries that were shipped. This record document is not submitted to any state agency, but it is provided upon request to an inspector. Now, there is no labeling requirements for these automotive batteries. We do not label these hazardous waste. We do not label these universal waste. The only thing that is recommended for these batteries to show how long they've been on site is we have an accumulation or a out of service start date, excuse me. You put an out of service date on these batteries, that demonstrates, hey, less than a year. I have more than a ton. These have been on site for less than 180 days. So that is the only thing that we do with these batteries that are reclaimed or recycled. Now, if the batteries are damaged, these lead acid automotive batteries, even damaged lead acid automotive batteries do not become hazardous waste. We could still recycle these for their core value. But we have to manage these to minimize the release of acid. We have to put these in a non-reactive, closed container. We don't have to label that container with anything other than the date the first damaged battery was first placed in that container. So it doesn't become hazardous waste, doesn't become universal waste, but we do have to put the date we first put the battery in there. Now, oil filters. Used oil is hazardous waste. Oil filters that are reclaimed for their scrap metal value. Not oil filters that go to a landfill, not paper oil filters, but metal oil filters that we could recycle for their scrap metal value if they are drained of all free-flowing liquid. We don't have to crush them, we have to drain them of free-flowing liquid. If we drain those of free-flowing liquid, we place those in a rainproof container that's closed. We label those, and they have to be labeled with this specific information. The container has to say drained, used oil filters, and we have to have an accumulation start date on that container. Now, oil filters, like batteries, we could store up to a ton for a year on site, regardless of our generator status. If we have more than a ton, we're limited to 180 days. In these oil filters, again, they're going off site, they're going to be recycled, reclaimed for their scrap metal value. We do not apply any waste codes. We don't use a manifest, but we do have to have a record, document, log, bill of lading, something that shows facility, address, day, amount of oil filters that were shipped off site. We keep those records for 3 years. We don't submit those to any agency. We provide those upon request. And here's an example of a label that could be used for drain used oil filters. Do not label these as hazardous waste. I have seen facilities, because they're recycled, label these as excluded recyclable materials. They are not excluded recyclable materials. They are not being recycled on site. I have seen facilities label these as used oil filters. That is not allowed. It has to say the words drain used oil filters. If we deviate, that could be a violation. So this is the only way to label those. Now, latex paint. If you are a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, not only latex paint, but also oil-based paint could be recycled, does not have to be managed as hazardous waste if you recycle it. If you are a small or a large quantity generator, you can't recycle your oil-based paint and have it exempt from haz waste regulations, but you can recycle your latex paint and it's exempt from haz waste regulations. Now, for your latex paint, has to be liquid. It has to be in a container, 5 gallons or less. The original container, good condition, closed. It has to have a label on it. 5 gallons or less. And we have to send this to a facility that is authorized to accept this latex paint to be recycled. We do not ship it as hazardous waste. We do not label it as hazardous waste. We do not use a uniform hazardous waste manifest when we send it out, but we do want to have a bill of lading document, a receipt, a record that shows when it was shipped off site, where it went, and the volume that was shipped off site. This record is not submitted to any regulatory agency. This latex paint, when it is stored on site, is not labeled as hazardous waste, not labeled as excluded recyclable material. There is no labeling requirements that apply to it. There are accumulation time limits, though. We cannot store this latex paint that we're going to send off site to be recycled for more than 180 days. Now, if you visit paintcare.org, you punch in California, your area code, they will provide you a list of facilities, companies, that could accept, including from businesses, latex paint to be recycled. Now, if you have a large volume of latex paint, you visit paintcare.org, they will actually pick it up for you, for free from your facility and send it offsite to be recycled. So if you want to look for an outlet to recycle your latex paint so you don't have to manage it as hazardous waste, visit paintcare.org. When you accumulate it, store it on site. Do not place it in a bulk container, 55-gallon drum, anything like that. Leave it in the 5-gallon, 1-gallon quart containers. Visit Paint Care. You'll find options where you could get rid of, recycle that latex paint. Now, lastly, universal waste. So these wastes are universal waste, which are hazardous waste. We have our own management standards for these universal wastes. And universal waste includes batteries, with the exception of those lead-acid automotive batteries, fluorescent light tubes, HID bulbs, sodium vapor bulbs, electronic devices, and that is essentially any piece of equipment device that has a printed circuit board. It includes mercury-containing devices in aerosol cans. So these wastes, we don't have to do a TTLC, STLC, T-clip to determine if it is or isn't a universal waste. We could use generator knowledge. Hey, that's an electronic device, it's universal waste. That is an aerosol can, it's universal waste. That is an alkaline battery, that is universal waste. Now, the universal waste standards are one and the same regardless of our generator status. So if we generate universal waste, there are some exemptions for conditionally exempt small quantity universal waste generators, but other than that, if we are not exempt, regardless of our generator status, we are considered a universal waste handler. We have to comply with the management standards outlined in 66273, with the exception for the aerosol cans, which includes processing aerosol cans, which is outlined within the Health and Safety Code. Now, universal waste. The management standards are similar to hazardous waste. Universal waste must be kept in a structurally sound container that's compatible with the waste, has no evidence of leaking, and is kept closed at all times, with a few exceptions. Universal waste must be labeled. Now, the labeling is a little different. For universal waste, we only need 2 items: the words universal waste and the type of universal waste. Now, it is recommended on the container that you include the accumulation start date, because what the regulations say is that we have to be able to demonstrate to an inspector how long that universal waste has been on site. The easiest way to do that is we include the accumulation start date. Now, universal waste, regardless small, large quantity generator, we could store it on site for 365 days. Within 365 days, that universal waste has to be shipped off site. We could ship it to 2 different locations or facilities: another universal waste handler or a destination facility that could accept, treat, handle that universal waste. When it's shipped off site, we don't use a manifest, not required to be shipped by a registered haz waste hauler, but we do have to have a tracking of that shipment. Name of the facility, address of the facility, phone number of the facility that it was sent to, types, volumes of universal waste, and the date that it was shipped. Now, for universal waste, containers don't need to be inspected. There is no such thing as central and satellite accumulation for universal waste. Just the container management standards: structurally sound, compatible with the waste, no evidence of leaking, closed. Now, closure, there are some exceptions. Electronic devices, a projector, a computer, a TV monitor, does not have to be placed in a container. We could put that on a shelf, on a pallet, shrink wrap it so it doesn't have to be in a closed container. The regulations say we must manage that to minimize a potential for a spill release. The other exceptions to container closure for universal waste are aerosol cans. Aerosol cans, containers that we accumulate universal waste aerosol cans in, can be open during the workday. At the end of the workday, container must be closed. And then batteries do not require to be kept in a closed container unless the batteries are damaged or leaking. Other than that, put it in a container, ship it off-site within a year, keep records, make sure it's labeled. We want to make sure that label is legible and visible. And here's the standard universal waste label. It's purple, but there is no requirement, size, shape, font, color of the labels that are required for universal waste. Other than it says universal waste, we identify what type of universal waste is in that container. We have to be able to demonstrate how long that universal waste has been on site. So therefore, we use the accumulation start date. Now, what you don't want to do, this is a bucket of alkaline batteries, marked as hazardous waste. However, if we did this at our facility, and we're a large quantity generator, now we have to inspect that bucket every single week. And we have to ship that bucket out within 90 days from the date we first place batteries in that bucket. And we have to keep a manifest. And that manifest has to be sent to DTSC. And we have to get a signed copy back. And we have to pay potentially $7.50 to DTSC for using that manifest to ship that waste out. So we do not want to do that. Now, you want to make sure containers are closed, so we have these lamps. Containers are open. That would be another violation. Now, in this area, we have one label to demarcate the area. We can do that for universal waste electronic devices, but lamps, batteries, aerosol cans, we need to label or mark each container. So if it's an electronic device, we demarcate the area. We use one label that is acceptable. For any other universal waste, we do not want to do that. This is your link. Believe it, I bet you wish you sat up front now, huh? You visit this link, you will be able to download a PDF of the manual. Now, this manual includes definitions from Title 22, Chapter 10. Container, tank, waste discarded, included in here. Section 3, it includes that information for making a hazardous waste determination. FKP, and everyone's leaving now. We got the link, bye. Make sure you pay $15 for your parking. You have a question, yes, sir. I'm not the generator. Those belong to the hotel. That is a great question. Yes. Oh, good question. For the manifest, who is authorized to sign the manifest? Whoever is trained has the appropriate training. So again, if you ship RCRA DOT regulated hazardous waste, employees would have to have training per 49 CFR 172-704 to sign that manifest. DOT hazmat employee. If it's non-RCRA, non-DOT regulated waste, then anyone who is trained understands, hey, we have to send this to DTSC, receive it, whatever the case is. Now Section 3, haz waste classification. For those of you folks still around, in Section 7 of this binder, we have guidance for typical waste streams that you guys may generate that we discuss here. Used oil, oily debris, waste paint, waste fuel, empty containers, aerosol cans, batteries. Within Section 7 of this binder, we tell you it's a hazardous waste. It is a universal waste. It could be recycled, how long you could store it on site, appropriate containers to use, and we provide you examples of the labels to be displayed on those containers. So that's all included in this document. Now, if you guys have any questions, feel free to stick around. As soon as everyone gets this information, I do have contact information for the company that you guys could call us, shoot us an email, visit our website, and we would be more than happy to answer any question we have. Yes.